Book 4. The Friends of the ABC. Chapter 1. A Group Which Barely Missed Becoming Historic. At that epoch, which was, to all appearances indifferent, a certain revolutionary quiver was vaguely current. Breaths which had started forth from the depths of 89 and 93 were in the air. Youth was on the point, may the reader pardon us the word, of molting. People were undergoing a transformation, almost without being conscious of it, through the movement of the age. The needle which moves round the compass also moves in souls. Each person was taking that step in advance which he was bound to take. The Royalists were becoming Liberals. Liberals were turning Democrats. It was a flood tide, complicated with 1,000 ebb movements. The peculiarity of ebbs is to create intermixtures, hence the combination of very singular ideas. People adored both Napoleon and liberty. We are making history here. These were the mirages of that period. Opinions traverse phases. Voltairean royalism, a quaint variety, had a no less singular sequel, Bonapartist liberalism. Other groups of minds were more serious. In that direction, they sounded principles. They attached themselves to the right. They grew enthusiastic for the absolute. They caught glimpses of infinite realizations. The absolute, by its very rigidity, urges spirits towards the sky and causes them to float in illimitable space. There's nothing like dogma for bringing forth dreams, and there is nothing like dreams for engendering the future. Utopia today, flesh and blood tomorrow. These advanced opinions had a double foundation. A beginning of mystery menaced the established order of things, which was suspicious and underhand. A sign which was revolutionary to the highest degree. The second thoughts of power meet the second thoughts of the populace in the mine. The incubation of insurrections gives the retort to the premeditation of coups d'état. There did not, as yet, exist in France any of those vast underlying organizations, like the German Tugendbund and Italian Carbonarism. But here and there were dark underminings, which were in process of throwing off shoots. The coup gourde was being outlined at A. There existed at Paris, among other affiliations of that nature, the Society of the Friends of the ABC. What were these Friends of the ABC? A society which had for its object apparently the education of children, in reality, the elevation of man. They declared themselves the Friends of the ABC, the abaissés, the debased, that is to say, the people. They wished to elevate the people. It was a pun which we would do wrong to smile at. Puns are sometimes serious factors in politics. Witness the castratus ad castra, which made a general of the army of Narcissus. Witness barbari et barbarini. Witness tu es petrus et super honc petrum, etc., etc. The Friends of the ABC were not numerous. It was a secret society in the state of embryo. We might almost say a coterie, if coteries ended in heroes. They assembled in Paris in two localities, near the fish market, in a wine shop called Corinth, of which more will be heard later on, and near the Pantheon in a little café in the Rue Saint-Michel called the Café Musain, now torn down. The first of these meeting places was close to the working man, the second to the students. The assemblies of the Friends of the ABC were usually held in a back room of the Café Musain. This hall, which was tolerably remote from the café, with which it was connected by an extremely long corridor, had 2 windows and an exit with a private stairway on the little Rue des Grès. There they smoked and drank and gambled and laughed. There they conversed in very loud tones about everything, and in whispers of other things. An old map of France under the Republic was nailed to the wall, a sign quite sufficient to excite the suspicion of a police agent. The greater part of the Friends of the ABC were students, who were on cordial terms with the working classes. Here are the names of the principal ones. They belong, in a certain measure, to history. Enjolras, Combeferre, Jean Prouvaire, Feuilly, Courfeyrac, Bahorel, L'Aigle or L'Aigle, Joly, Grantaire. These young men formed a sort of family through the bond of friendship. All, with the exception of L'Aigle, were from the south. This was a remarkable group. It vanished in the invisible depths which lie behind us. At the point of this drama we have now reached, it will not perhaps be superfluous to throw a ray of light upon these youthful heads, before the reader beholds them plunging into the shadow of a tragic adventure. Enjolras, whose name we have mentioned first of all, the reader shall see why later on, was an only son, and wealthy. Enjolras was a charming young man, who was capable of being terrible. He was angelically handsome. He was a savage Antinous. One would have said, to see the pensive thoughtfulness of his glance, that he had already, in some previous state of existence, traversed the revolutionary apocalypse. He possessed the tradition of it as though he had been a witness. He was acquainted with all the minute details of the great affair. A pontifical and warlike nature, a singular thing in a youth. He was an officiating priest and a man of war. From the immediate point of view, a soldier of the democracy. Above the contemporary movement, the priest of the ideal. His eyes were deep, his lids a little red, his lower lip was thick and easily became disdainful. His brow was lofty. A great deal of brow in a face is like a great deal of horizon in a view. Like certain young men at the beginning of this century and at the end of the last, who became illustrious at an early age, he was endowed with excessive youth, and was as rosy as a young girl, although subject to hours of pallor. Already a man, he still seemed a child. His 22 years appeared to be but 17. He was serious. It did not seem as though he were aware there was on earth a thing called woman. He had but one passion, the right, but one thought, to overthrow the obstacle. On Mount Aventine he would have been Gracchus. In the Convention he would have been Saint-Just. He hardly saw the roses. He ignored spring. He did not hear the caroling of the birds. The bare throat of Evadne would have moved him no more than it would have moved Aristogeiton. He, like Harmodius, thought flowers good for nothing, except to conceal the sword. He was severe in his enjoyments. He chastely dropped his eyes before everything which was not the Republic. He was the marble lover of liberty. His speech was harshly inspired, and had the thrill of a hymn. He was subject to unexpected outbursts of soul. Woe to the love affair which should have risked itself beside him. If Eddie Grisette of the Place Cambrai or the Rue Saint-Jean-de-Beauvais, seeing that face of a youth escaped from college, that page's mien, those long golden lashes, those blue eyes, that hair billowing in the wind, those rosy cheeks, those fresh lips, those exquisite teeth, had conceived an appetite for that complete Aurora, and had tried her beauty on Enjolras, an astounding and terrible glance would have promptly shown her the abyss, and would have taught her not to confound the mighty cherub of Ezekiel with the gallant cherubino of Beaumarchais. By the side of Enjolras, who represented the logic of the Revolution, Combeferre represented its philosophy. Between the logic of the Revolution and its philosophy, there exists this difference, that its logic may end in war, whereas its philosophy can end only in peace. Combeferre complimented and rectified Enjolras. He was less lofty, but broader. He desired to pour into all minds the extensive principles of general ideas. He said, "Revolution, but civilization." And around the mountain peak he opened out a vast view of the blue sky. The Revolution was more adapted for breathing with Combeferre than with Enjolras. Enjolras expressed its divine right, and Combeferre its natural right. The first attached himself to Robespierre, the second confined himself to Condorcet. Combeferre lived the life of all the rest of the world more than did Enjolras. If it had been granted to these two young men to attain to history, the one would have been the just, the other the wise man. Enjolras was the more virile, Combeferre the more humane. Homo and vir, that was the exact effect of their different shades. Combeferre was as gentle as Enjolras was severe, through natural whiteness. He loved the word citizen, but he preferred the word man. He would gladly have said hombre like the Spanish. He read everything, went to the theaters, attended the courses of public lectures, learned the polarization of light from Arago, grew enthusiastic over a lesson in which Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire explained the double function of the external carotid artery and the internal, the one which makes the face, and the one which makes the brain. He kept up with what was going on, followed science step by step, compared Saint-Simon with Fourier, deciphered hieroglyphics, broke the pebble which he found and reasoned on geology, drew from memory a silkworm moth, pointed out the faulty French in the dictionary of the Academy, studied Puységur and Deleuze, affirmed nothing, not even miracles, denied nothing, not even ghosts, turned over the files of the Moniteur, reflected. He declared that the future lies in the hand of the schoolmaster, and busied himself with educational questions. He desired that society should labor without relaxation at the elevation of the moral and intellectual level, at coining science, at putting ideas into circulation, at increasing the mind in youthful persons. And he feared lest the present poverty of method, the paltriness from a literary point of view confined to 2 or 3 centuries called classic, the tyrannical dogmatism of official pedants, scholastic prejudices, and routines should end by converting our colleges into artificial oyster beds. He was learned, a purist, exact, a graduate of the Polytechnic, a close student, and at the same time thoughtful, even to chimeras, so his friends said. He believed in all dreams, railroads, the suppression of suffering in surgical operations, the fixing of images in the dark chamber, the electric telegraph, the steering of balloons. Moreover, he was not much alarmed by the citadels erected against the human mind in every direction, by superstition, despotism, and prejudice. He was one of those who think that science will eventually turn the position. Enjolras was a chief. Combeferre was a guide. One would have liked to fight under the one, and to march behind the other. It is not that Combeferre was not capable of fighting. He did not refuse a hand-to-hand combat with the obstacle, and to attack it by main force and explosively. But it suited him better to bring the human race into accord with its destiny gradually, by means of education, the inculcation of axioms, the promulgation of positive laws. And, between two lights, his preference was rather for illumination than for conflagration. A conflagration can create an aurora, no doubt, but why not await the dawn? A volcano illuminates, but daybreak furnishes a still better illumination. Possibly Combeferre preferred the whiteness of the beautiful to the blaze of the sublime. A light troubled by smoke, progress purchased at the expense of violence, only half satisfied this tender and serious spirit. The headlong precipitation of a people into the truth, a 93, terrified him. Nevertheless, stagnation was still more repulsive to him. In it he detected putrefaction and death. On the whole, he preferred scum to miasma, and he preferred the torrent to the cesspool, and the falls of Niagara to the lake of Montfaucon. In short, he desired neither halt nor haste. While his tumultuous friends, captivated by the absolute, adored and invoked splendid revolutionary adventures, Combeferre was inclined to let progress, good progress, take its own course. He may have been cold, but he was pure, methodical, but irreproachable, phlegmatic, but imperturbable. Combeferre would have knelt and clasped his hands to enable the future to arrive in all its candor, and that nothing might disturb the immense and virtuous evolution of the races. The good must be innocent, he repeated incessantly. And in fact, if the grandeur of the revolution consists in keeping the dazzling ideal fixedly in view, and of soaring thither athwart the lightnings, with fire and blood in its talons, the beauty of progress lies in being spotless. And there exists between Washington, who represents the one, and Danton, who incarnates the other, that difference which separates the swan from the angel with the wings of an eagle. Jean Prouvaire was a still softer shade than Combeferre. His name was Jehan, owing to that petty momentary freak which mingled with the powerful and profound movement which sprang the very essential study of the Middle Ages. Jean Prouvaire was in love. He cultivated a pot of flowers, played on the flute, made verses, loved the people, pitied woman, wept over the child, confounded God and the future in the same confidence, and blamed the revolution for having caused the fall of a royal head, that of André Chénier. His voice was ordinarily delicate, but suddenly grew manly. He was learned even to erudition, and almost an Orientalist. Above all, he was good, and a very simple thing to those who know how nearly goodness borders on grandeur. In the matter of poetry, he preferred the immense. He knew Italian, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, and these served him only for the perusal of four poets, Dante, Juvenal, Aeschylus, and Isaiah. In French, he preferred Corneille to Racine, and Agrippa d'Aubigné to Corneille. He loved to saunter through fields of wild oats and cornflowers, and busied himself with clouds nearly as much as with events. His mind had two attitudes, one on the side towards man, the other on that towards God. He studied, or he contemplated. All day long he buried himself in social questions: salary, capital, credit, marriage, religion, liberty of thought, education, penal servitude, poverty, association, property, production and sharing, the enigma of this lower world which covers the human ant-hill with darkness. And at night he gazed upon the planets, those enormous beings. Like Enjolras, he was wealthy and an only son. He spoke softly, bowed his head, lowered his eyes, smiled with embarrassment, dressed badly, had an awkward air, blushed at a mere nothing, and was very timid. Yet he was intrepid. Feuilly was a working man, a fan maker, orphaned both of father and mother, who earned with difficulty 3 francs a day, and had but one thought: to deliver the world. He had one other preoccupation: to educate himself. He called this also delivering himself. He had taught himself to read and write. Everything that he knew he had learned by himself. Feuilly had a generous heart. The range of his embrace was immense. This orphan had adopted the peoples. As his mother had failed him, he meditated on his country. He brooded with the profound divination of the man of the people over what we now call the idea of the nationality, had learned history with the express object of raging with full knowledge of the case. In this club of young utopians, occupied chiefly with France, he represented the outside world. He had for his specialty Greece, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Italy. He uttered these names incessantly, appropriately and inappropriately, with the tenacity of right. the violations of Turkey on Greece and Thessaly, of Russia on Warsaw, of Austria on Venice, enraged him. Above all things, the great violence of 1772 aroused him. There is no more sovereign eloquence than the true in indignation. He was eloquent with that eloquence. He was inexhaustible on that infamous date of 1772, on the subject of that noble and valiant race suppressed by treason, and that three-sided crime, on that monstrous ambush, the prototype and pattern of all those horrible suppressions of states, which, since that time, have struck many a noble nation, and have annulled their certificate of birth, so to speak. All contemporary social crimes have their origin in the partition of Poland. The partition of Poland is a theorem of which all present political outrages are the corollaries. There has not been a despot, nor a traitor for nearly a century back, who has not signed, approved, countersigned, and copied, ne variatur, the partition of Poland. When the record of modern treasons was examined, that was the first thing which made its appearance. The Congress of Vienna consulted that crime before consummating its own. 1772 sounded the onset. 1815 was the death of the game. Such was Feuilly's habitual text. This poor working man had constituted himself the tutor of justice, and she recompensed him by rendering him great. The fact is that there is eternity in right. Warsaw can no more be Tartar than Venice can be Teuton. Kings lose their pains and their honor in the attempt to make them so. Sooner or later, the submerged part floats to the surface and reappears. Greece becomes Greece again. Italy is once more Italy. The protest of right against the deed persists forever. The theft of a nation cannot be allowed by prescription. These lofty deeds of rascality have no future. A nation cannot have its mark extracted like a pocket handkerchief. Courfeyrac had a father who was called Monsieur de Courfeyrac. One of the false ideas of the bourgeoisie under the Restoration, as regards aristocracy and the nobility, was to believe in the particle. The particle, as everyone knows, possesses no significance. But the bourgeois of the epoch of La Minerve estimated so highly that poor de that they thought themselves bound to abdicate it. Monsieur de Chauvelin had called himself Monsieur Chauvelin. Monsieur de Comortin, Monsieur Comortin. Monsieur de Constant de Robec, Benjamin Constant. Monsieur de Lafayette, Monsieur Lafayette. Courfeyrac had not wished to remain behind the rest, and called himself plain Courfeyrac. We might almost, so far as Courfeyrac is concerned, stop here, and confine ourselves to saying with regard to what remains, for Courfeyrac, see Tholomyès. Courfeyrac had, in fact, that animation of youth, which may be called the beauté du diable of the mind. Later on, this disappears like the playfulness of the kitten, and all this grace ends with the bourgeois on 2 legs and with the tomcat on 4 paws. This sort of wit is transmitted from generation to generation of the successive levies of youth who traverse the schools, who pass it from hand to hand, quasi cursores, and is almost always exactly the same. So that, as we have just pointed out, anyone who had listened to Courfeyrac in 1828 would have thought he heard Tholomyès in 1817. Only, Courfeyrac was an honorable fellow. Beneath the apparent similarities of the exterior mind, the difference between him and Tholomyès was very great. The latent man which existed in the two was totally different in the first from what it was in the second. There was in Tholomyès a district attorney, and in Courfeyrac a paladin. Enjolras was the chief, Combeferre was the guide, Courfeyrac was the center. The others gave more light, he shed more warmth. The truth is that he possessed all the qualities of a center, roundness and radiance. Bahorel had figured in the bloody tumult of June 1822 on the occasion of the burial of young Lallemand. Bahorel was a good-natured mortal who kept bad company. Brave, a spendthrift, prodigal, and, to the verge of generosity, talkative and at times eloquent, bold to the verge of effrontery, the best fellow possible. He had daring waistcoats and scarlet opinions. A wholesale blusterer, that is to say, loving nothing so much as a quarrel, unless it were an uprising, and nothing so much as an uprising, unless it were a revolution. Always ready to smash a window pane, then to tear up the pavement, then to demolish a government, just to see the effect of it. A student in his 11th year. He had nosed about the law, but did not practice it. He had taken for his device, never a lawyer, and for his armorial bearings, a nightstand in which was visible a square cap. Every time that he passed the law school, which rarely happened, he buttoned up his frock coat, the paletot had not yet been invented, and took hygienic precautions. Of the school porter, he said, "What a fine old man," and of the dean, Monsieur Delvincourt, "What a monument." In his lectures, he espied subjects for ballads, and in his professors, occasions for caricature. He wasted a tolerably large allowance, something like 3,000 francs a year, in doing nothing. He had peasant parents, whom he had contrived to imbue with respect for their son. He said of them, "They are peasants and not bourgeois. That is the reason they are intelligent." Bahorel, a man of caprice, was scattered over numerous cafés. The others had habits, he had none. He sauntered. To stray is human. To saunter is Parisian. In reality, he had a penetrating mind, and was more of a thinker than appeared to view. He served as a connecting link between the Friends of the ABC and other still unorganized groups, which were destined to take form later on. In this conclave of young heads, there was one bald member. The Marquis d'Avaray, whom Louis XVIII made a duke for having assisted him to enter a hackney coach on the day when he emigrated, was wont to relate that in 1814, on his return to France, as the king was disembarking at Calais, a man handed him a petition. "What is your request?" said the king. "Sire, a post office." "What is your name?" "L'Aigle." The king frowned, glanced at the signature of the petition, and beheld the name written thus, Lesgle. This non-Bonaparte orthography touched the king, and he began to smile. "Sire," resumed the man with the petition, "I had for ancestor a keeper of the hounds, surnamed L'Aiguille. This surname furnished my name. I am called L'Aiguille, by contraction L'Aigle, and by corruption L'Aigle." This caused the king to smile broadly. Later on, he gave the man the posting office of Meaux, either intentionally or accidentally. The bald member of the group was the son of this L'Aigle, or L'Aigle, and he signed himself L'Aigle de Meaux. As an abbreviation, his companions called him Bossuet. Bossuet was a gay but unlucky fellow. His specialty was not to succeed in anything. As an offset, he laughed at everything. At 25, he was bald. His father had ended by owning a house and a field, but he, the son, had made haste to lose that house and field in a bad speculation. He had nothing left. He possessed knowledge and wit, but all he did miscarried. Everything failed him, and everybody deceived him. What he was building tumbled down on top of him. If he were splitting wood, he cut off a finger. If he had a mistress, he speedily discovered that he had a friend also. Some misfortune happened to him every moment, hence his joviality. He said, "I live under falling tiles." He was not easily astonished, because, for him, an accident was what he had foreseen. He took his bad luck serenely, and smiled at the teasing of fate, like a person who is listening to pleasantries. He was poor, but his fund of good humor was inexhaustible. He soon reached his last sou, never his last burst of laughter. When adversity entered his doors, he saluted this old acquaintance cordially. He tapped all catastrophes on the stomach. He was familiar with fatality to the point of calling it by its nickname. "Good day, Guignon," he said to it. These persecutions of fate had rendered him inventive. He was full of resources. He had no money, but he found means, when it seemed good to him, to indulge in unbridled extravagance. One night he went so far as to eat 100 francs in a supper with a wench, which inspired him to make this memorable remark in the midst of the orgy: "Pull off my boots, you 5-louis jade." Bossuet was slowly directing his steps towards the profession of a lawyer. He was pursuing his law studies after the manner of Bahorel. Bossuet had not much domicile, sometimes none at all. He lived now with one, now with another, most often with Joly. Joly was studying medicine. He was 2 years younger than Bossuet. Joly was the malade imaginaire junior. What he had won in medicine was to be more of an invalid than a doctor. At 23 he thought himself a valetudinarian, and passed his life in inspecting his tongue in the mirror. He affirmed that man becomes magnetic, like a needle, and in his chamber he placed his bed with its head to the south and the foot to the north, so that, at night, the circulation of his blood might not be interfered with by the great electric current of the globe. During thunderstorms he felt his pulse. Otherwise, he was the gayest of them all. All these young, maniacal, puny, merry incoherences lived in harmony together, and the result was an eccentric and agreeable being, whom his comrades, who were prodigal of winged consonants, called Joly. "You may fly away on the 4 L's," Jean Prouvaire said to him. Joly had a trick of touching his nose with the tip of his cane, which is an indication of a sagacious mind. All these young men, who differed so greatly, and who, on the whole, can only be discussed seriously, held the same religion: progress. All were the direct sons of the French Revolution. The most giddy of them became solemn when they pronounced that date, 89. Their fathers in the flesh had been either royalists, doctrinaires, it matters not what. This confusion anterior to themselves, who were young, did not concern them at all. The pure blood of principle ran in their veins. They attached themselves, without intermediate shades, to incorruptible right and absolute duty. Affiliated and initiated, they sketched out the ideal underground. Among all these glowing hearts and thoroughly convinced minds, there was one skeptic. How came he there? By juxtaposition. This skeptic's name was Grantaire, and he was in the habit of signing himself with this rebus, R. Grantaire was a man who took good care not to believe in anything. Moreover, he was one of the students who had learned the most during their courses at Paris. He knew that the best coffee was to be had at the Café Lemblin, and the best billiards at the Café Voltaire, that good cakes and lasses were to be found at the Hermitage on the Boulevard du Maine, spatchcocked chickens at Mother Sauget's, excellent matelotes in the Barrière de la Cunette, and a certain thin white wine at the Barrière du Combe Pat. He knew the best place for everything. In addition, boxing and foot fencing, and some dances. and he was a thorough single-stick player. He was a tremendous drinker to boot. He was inordinately homely. The prettiest boot-stitcher of that day, Irma Boissy, enraged with his homeliness, pronounced sentence on him as follows: "Grantaire is impossible." But Grantaire's fatuity was not to be disconcerted. He stared tenderly and fixedly at all women, with the air of saying to them all, "If I only chose," and of trying to make his comrades believe that he was in general demand. All those words, rights of the people, rights of man, the social contract, the French Revolution, the Republic, democracy, humanity, civilization, religion, progress, came very near to signifying nothing whatever to Grantaire. He smiled at them. Skepticism, that carries of the intelligence, had not left him a single whole idea. He lived with irony. This was his axiom: there is but one certainty, my full glass. He sneered at all devotion in all parties, the father as well as the brother, Robespierre Jr. as well as Loizerolles. "They are greatly in advance to be dead," he exclaimed. He said of the crucifix, "There is a gibbet which has been a success." A rover, a gambler, a libertine, often drunk, he displeased these young dreamers by humming incessantly, "J'aime les filles et j'aime le bon vin." Air, vive Henri IV. However, this skeptic had one fanaticism. This fanaticism was neither a dogma, nor an idea, nor an art, nor a science. It was a man, Enjolras. Grantaire admired, loved, and venerated Enjolras. To whom did this anarchical scoffer unite himself in this phalanx of absolute minds? To the most absolute. In what manner had Enjolras subjugated him? By his ideas? No, by his character. A phenomenon which is often observable. A skeptic who adheres to a believer is as simple as the law of complementary colors. That which we lack attracts us. No one loves the light like the blind man. The dwarf adores the drum major. The toad always has his eyes fixed on heaven. Why? In order to watch the bird in its flight. Grantaire, in whom writhed doubt, loved to watch faith soar in Enjolras. He had need of Enjolras. That chaste, healthy, firm, upright, hard, candid nature charmed him, without his clearly being aware of it, and without the idea of explaining it to himself having occurred to him. He admired his opposite by instinct. His soft, yielding, dislocated, sickly, shapeless ideas attached themselves to Enjolras as to a spinal column. His moral backbone leaned on that firmness. Grantaire, in the presence of Enjolras, became someone once more. He was, himself, moreover, composed of two elements, which were, to all appearances, incompatible. He was ironical and cordial. His indifference loved. His mind could get along without belief, but his heart could not get along without friendship. A profound contradiction, for an affection is a conviction. His nature was thus constituted. There are men who seem to be born to be the reverse, the obverse, the wrong side. They are Pollux, Patroclus, Nisus, Eudamidas, Hephaestion, Peshmerga. They only exist on condition that they are backed up with another man. Their name is a sequel, and is only written preceded by the conjunction and their existence is not their own. It is the other side of an existence which is not theirs. Grantaire was one of these men. He was the obverse of Enjolras. One might almost say that affinities begin with the letters of the alphabet. In the series, O and P are inseparable. You can, at will, pronounce O and P, or Orestes and Pylades. Grantaire, Enjolras' true satellite, inhabited this circle of young men. He lived there. He took no pleasure anywhere but there. He followed them everywhere. His joy was to see these forms go and come through the fumes of wine. They tolerated him on account of his good humor. Enjolras, the believer, disdained this skeptic, and, a sober man himself, scorned this drunkard. He accorded him a little, lofty pity. Grantaire was an unaccepted Pylades, always harshly treated by Enjolras, roughly repulsed, rejected yet ever returning to the charge. He said of Enjolras, "What fine marble!" End of Book 4, Chapter 1. Recording by Adam Ringeth.
Book 4, The Friends of the ABC, Chapter 2, Blondot's Funeral Oration by Bossuet. On a certain afternoon, which had, as will be seen hereafter, some coincidence with the events heretofore related, L'Aigle des Meaux was to be seen leaning in a sensual manner against the doorpost of the Café Moussin. He had the air of a caryatid on a vacation. He carried nothing but his reverie, however. He was staring at the Place Saint-Michel. To lean one's back against a thing is equivalent to lying down while standing erect, which attitude is not hated by thinkers. L'Aigle des Meaux was pondering without melancholy over a little misadventure which had befallen him 2 days previously at the law school, and which had modified his personal plans for the future, plans which were rather indistinct at any case. Reverie does not prevent a cab from passing by, nor the dreamer from taking note of that cab. L'Aigle des Meaux, whose eyes were straying about in a sort of diffuse lounging, perceived, athwart his somnambulism, a two-wheeled vehicle proceeding through the place, at a foot pace and apparently in indecision. For whom was this cabriolet? Why was it driving at a walk? L'Aigle took a survey. In it, beside the coachman, sat a young man, and in front of the young man lay a rather bulky handbag. The bag displayed to passers-by the following name, inscribed in large black letters on a card which was sewn to the stuff: Marius Pontmercy. This name caused L'Aigle to change his attitude. He drew himself up and hurled this apostrophe at the young man in the cabriolet: "Monsieur Marius Pontmercy!" The cabriolet thus addressed came to a halt. The young man, who also seemed deeply buried in thought, raised his eyes. "Hey?" said he. "You are Monsieur Marius Pontmercy?" "Certainly." "I was looking for you," resumed L'Aigle des Meaux. "How so?" demanded Marius, for it was he. In fact, he had just quitted his grandfather's, and had before him a face which he now beheld for the first time. "I do not know you." "Neither do I know you," responded L'Aigle. Marius thought he had encountered a wag, the beginning of a mystification in the open street. He was not in a very good humour at the moment. He frowned. L'Aigle des Meaux went on imperturbably. "You were not at the school the day before yesterday." "That is possible." "That is certain." "You are a student?" demanded Marius. "Yes, sir, like yourself. Day before yesterday I entered the school, by chance." "You know, one does have such freaks sometimes. The professor was just calling the roll. You are not unaware that they are very ridiculous on such occasions. At the third call, unanswered, your name is erased from the list. 60 francs in the gulf." Marius began to listen. It was Blondeau who was making the call. You know Blondeau. He has a very pointed and a very malicious nose, and he delights to scent out the absent. He slyly began with the letter P. I was not listening, not being compromised by that letter. The call was not going badly. No erasures, the universe was present. Blondeau was grieved. I said to myself, "Blondeau, my love, you will not get the very smallest sort of an execution today." All at once, Blondeau calls, "Marius Pontmercy!" No one answers. Blondeau, filled with hope, repeats more loudly, "Marius Pontmercy!" And he takes his pen. "Monsieur, I have the bowels of compassion." I said to myself hastily, "Here's a brave fellow who is going to get scratched out. Attention! Here is a veritable mortal who is not exact. He is not a good student. Here is none of your heavy-sides, a student who studies, a greenhorn pedant, strong on letters, theology, science, and sapience. One of those dull wits cut by the square, a pin by profession. He is an honourable idler who lounges, who practises country jaunts, who cultivates the grisette, who pays court with the fair sex, who is at this very moment perhaps with my mistress. Let us save him. Death to Blondeau. At that moment Blondeau dipped his pen in, all black with erasures in the ink, cast his yellow eyes around the audience room, and repeated for the third time, "Marius Pontmercy." I replied, "Present." "That is why you were not crossed off." "Monsieur," said Marius. "And why I was," added Laigle des Mots. "I do not understand you," said Marius. Laigle resumed, "Nothing is more simple. I was close to the desk to reply, and close to the door for the purpose of flight. The professor gazed at me with a certain intensity. All of a sudden, Blondeau, who must be the malicious nose alluded to by Boileau, skipped the letter L. L is my letter. I am from Meaux. My name is Laigle." "Laigle!" interrupted Marius. "What a fine name!" "Monsieur, Blondeau came to this fine name and called, 'Laigle.' I reply, 'Present.' Then Blondeau gazes at me with the gentleness of a tiger, and says to me, 'If you are Pontmercy, you are not Laigle.' A phrase which had a disobliging air for you, but which was lugubrious only for me. That said, he crossed me off. Marius exclaimed, 'I am mortified, sir!' 'First of all,' interposed Laigle, 'I demand permission to embalm Blondeau in a few phrases of deeply felt eulogium. I will assume that he is dead. There will be no great change required in his gauntness, in his pallor, in his coldness, and in his smell. And I say, erudimini qui jucatis terram. Here lies Blondeau, Blondeau the nose, Blondeau Nasica, the ox of discipline, bos disciplinae, the bloodhound of the password, the angel of the roll call, who was upright, square exact, rigid, honest, and hideous. God crossed him off as he crossed me off." Marius resumed, "I am very sorry." "Young man," said Laigle des Mots, "let this serve you as a lesson. In future, be exact. I really beg you 1,000 pardons. Do not expose your neighbour to the danger of having his name erased again." "I am extremely sorry." Laigle burst out laughing. "And I am delighted. I was on the brink of becoming a lawyer. This erasure saves me. I renounce the triumphs of the bar. I shall not defend the widow, and I shall not attack the orphan. No more toga, no more stage. Here is my erasure, all ready for me. It is to you that I am indebted for it, Monsieur Pontmercy. I intend to pay a solemn call of thanks upon you. Where do you live?" "In this cab," said Marius. "A sign of opulence," retorted Laigle calmly. "I congratulate you. You have there a rent of 9,000 francs per annum." At that moment, Courfeyrac emerged from the café. Marius smiled sadly. "I have paid this rent for the last 2 hours, and I aspire to get rid of it. But there is a sort of history attached to it, and I don't know where to go." "Come to my place, sir," said Courfeyrac. "I have the priority," observed Laigle, "but I have no home." "Hold your tongue, Bossuet," said Courfeyrac. "Bossuet," said Marius, "but I thought that your name was Laigle." "Des Mots," replied Laigle. "By metaphor, Bossuet." Courfeyrac entered the cab. "Coachman," said he, "Hôtel de la Porte Saint-Jacques." And that very evening, Marius found himself installed in a chamber of the Hôtel de la Porte Saint-Jacques, side by side with Courfeyrac. End of chapter 4.
Book 4th, The Friends of the ABC. Chapter 3, Marius's Astonishments. In a few days, Marius had become Courfeyrac's friend. Youth is a season for prompt welding and the rapid healing of scars. Marius breathed freely in Courfeyrac's society, a decidedly new thing for him. Courfeyrac put no questions to him. He did not even think of such a thing. At that age, faces disclose everything on the spot. Words are superfluous. These are young men of whom it can be said that their countenances chatter. One look at them, and one knows them. One morning, however, Courfeyrac abruptly addressed this interrogation to him. "By the way, have you any political opinions?" "The idea," said Marius, almost affronted by the question. "What are you?" "A Democrat Bonapartist." "The grey hue of a reassured rat," said Courfeyrac. On the following day, Courfeyrac introduced Marius at the Café Musson. Then he whispered in his ear with a smile, "I must give you your entry to the Revolution." And he led him to the hall of the Friends of the ABC. He presented him to the other comrades, saying this simple word which Marius did not understand, "A pupil." Marius had fallen into a wasp's nest of wits. However, although he was silent and grave, he was none the less both winged and armed. Marius, up to that time solitary and inclined to soliloquy and to asides, both by habit and by taste, was a little fluttered by this covey of young men around him. All these various initiatives solicited his attention at once, and pulled him about. The tumultuous movements of these minds at liberty and at work set his ideas in a whirl. Sometimes in his trouble they led so far from him that he had difficulty in recovering them. He heard them talk of philosophy, of literature, of art, of history, of religion in unexpected fashion. He caught glimpses of strange aspects, and, as he did not place them in proper perspective, he was not altogether sure that it was not chaos that he grasped. On abandoning his grandfather's opinions for the opinions of his father, he had supposed himself fixed. With uneasiness, and without daring to avow it to himself, that he was not. The angle at which he saw everything began to be displaced anew. A certain oscillation set all the horizons of his brains in motion. An odd interval upsetting. He almost suffered from it. It seemed as though there were no consecrated things for those young men. Marius heard singular propositions on every sort of subject, which embarrassed his still timid mind. A theatre poster presented itself, adorned with the title of a tragedy from the ancient repertory called classic. "Down with tragedy dear to the bourgeois," cried Barruel, and Marius heard Combeferre reply, "You are wrong, Barruel. The bourgeoisie loves tragedy, and the bourgeoisie must be left at peace on that score. Bewigged tragedy has a reason for its existence, and I am not one of those who, by the order of Aeschylus, contest its right to existence. There are rough outlines in nature. There are in creation ready-made parodies, a beak which is not a beak, wings which are not wings, gills which are not gills, paws which are not paws, a cry of pain which arouses a desire to laugh. There is the duck. Now, since poultry exists by the side of the bird, I do not see why classic tragedy should not exist in the face of antique tragedy." Or chance decreed that Marius should traverse Rue Jean-Jacques Rousseau between Enjolras and Courfeyrac. Courfeyrac took his arm. "Pay attention. This is the Rue Plâtrier, now called Rue Jean-Jacques Rousseau, on account of a singular household which lived in it 60 years ago. This consisted of Jean-Jacques and Therese. From time to time, little beings were born here. Therese gave birth to them. Jean-Jacques represented them as foundlings." And Enjolras addressed Courfeyrac roughly. "Silence in the presence of Jean-Jacques. I admire that man. He denied his own children, that may be, but he adopted the people." Not one of these young men articulated the word "the Emperor." Jean Prouvaire alone sometimes said Napoleon. All the others said Bonaparte. Enjolras pronounced it Buonaparte. Marius was vaguely surprised. Initium sapientiae. End of Book 4th, Chapter 3. Recording by Mistopheles.
Book 4, The Friends of the ABC. Chapter 4, The Back Room of the Café Musain. One of the conversations among the young men at which Marius was present and in which he sometimes joined was a veritable shock to his mind. This took place in the back room of the Café Musain. Nearly all of the friends of the ABC had convened that evening. The argand lamp was solemnly lighted. They talked of one thing and another without passion and with noise. With the exception of Enjolras and Marius, who held their peace, all were haranguing rather at haphazard. Conversations between comrades sometimes are subject to these peaceable tumults. It was a game and an uproar as much as a conversation. They tossed words to each other and caught them up in turn. They were chattering in all quarters. No woman was admitted to this back room except Louison, the dishwasher of the café, who passed through it from time to go to her washing in the lavatory. Grantaire, thoroughly drunk, was deafening the corner of which he had taken possession, reasoning and contradicting at the top of his lungs, and shouting, "I am thirsty! Mortals! I am dreaming that the tun of Heidelberg has an attack of apoplexy, and that I am one of the dozen leeches which will be applied to it. I want a drink. I desire to forget life. Life is a hideous invention of I know not whom. It lasts no time at all and is worth nothing. One breaks one's neck in living. Life is a theatre set in which there are but few practicable entrances. Happiness is an antique reliquary, painted on one side only. Ecclesiastes says all is vanity. I agree with that good man, who never existed, perhaps. Zero, not wishing to go stark naked, clothed himself in vanity. Oh, vanity, the patching up of everything with big words. A kitchen is a laboratory. A dancer is a professor. An acrobat is a gymnast. A boxer is a pugilist. An apothecary is a chemist. A wig maker is an artist. A hodman is an architect. A jockey is a sportsman. A woodlouse is a terrigibranche. Vanity has a right and a wrong side. The right side is stupid. It is the Negro with his glass beads. The wrong side is foolish. It is the philosopher with his rags. I weep over the one and I laugh over the other. What are called honors and dignities, and even dignity and honor, are generally of pinchbeck. Kings make playthings of human pride. Caligula made a horse a consul. Charles II made a knight of a sirloin. Wrap yourself up now, then, between consul incitatus and baronet roast beef. As for the intrinsic value of people, it is no longer respectable in the least. Listen to the panegyric which neighbor makes of neighbor. White on white is ferocious. If the lily could speak, what a setting down it would give the dove. A bigoted woman prating of a devout woman is more venomous than the asp and the cobra. It is a shame that I am ignorant. Otherwise I would quote to you a mass of things, but I know nothing. For instance, I have always been witty. When I was a pupil of Gros, instead of daubing wretched little pictures, I passed my time in pilfering apples. Rapin is the masculine of rapine. So much for myself. As for the rest of you, you are worth no more than I am. I scoff at your perfections, excellencies, and qualities. Every good quality tends towards a defect. Economy borders on avarice. The generous man is next door to the prodigal. The brave man rubs elbows with the braggart. He who says very pious says a trifle bigoted. There are just as many vices in virtue as there are holes in Diogenes' cloak. Whom do you admire, the slain or the slayer, Caesar or Brutus? Generally, men are in favor of the slayer. Long live Brutus, he has slain. There lies the virtue. Virtue granted, but madness also. There are queer spots on those great men. The Brutus who killed Caesar was in love with the statue of a little boy. This statue was from the hand of the Greek sculptor Strongyllion, who also carved that figure of an Amazon known as the beautiful leg, Eucnemos, which Nero carried with him in his travels. This Strongyllion left but two statues which placed Nero and Brutus in accord. Brutus was in love with the one, Nero with the other. All history is nothing but wearisome repetition. One century is the plagiarist of the other. The Battle of Marengo copies the Battle of Pydna. The Tolbiac of Clovis and the Austerlitz of Napoleon are as like each other as two drops of water. I don't attach much importance to victory. Nothing is so stupid as to conquer. True glory lies in convincing. But try to prove something. If you are content with success, what mediocrity! And with conquering, what wretchedness! Alas, vanity and cowardice everywhere. Everything obeys success, even grammar. Si volet usus, says Horace. Therefore, I disdain the human race. Shall we descend to the party at all? Do you wish me to begin admiring the peoples? What people, if you please? Shall it be Greece? The Athenians, those Parisians of days gone by, slew Phocion, as we might say Coligny, and fawned upon tyrants to such an extent that Anicephorus said of Pisistratus, his urine attracts the bees. The most prominent man in Greece for 50 years was that grammarian Philetus, who was so small and so thin that he was obliged to load his shoes with lead in order not to be blown away by the wind. There stood on the great square in Corinth a statue carved by Silanion and catalogued by Pliny. This statue represented Episthates. What did Episthates do? He invented a trip. That sums up Greece and glory. Let us pass on to others. Shall I admire England? Shall I admire France? France? Why? Because of Paris? I've just told you my opinion of Athens. England? Why? Because of London? I hate Carthage. And then London, the metropolis of luxury, is the headquarters of wretchedness. There are 100 deaths a year of hunger in the parish of Charing Cross alone. Such is Albion. I add, as the climax, that I have seen an Englishwoman dancing in a wreath of roses and blue spectacles. A fig, then, for England. If I do not admire John Bull, shall I admire brother Jonathan? I have but little taste for that slave-holding brother. Take away time is money, what remains of England? Take away cotton is king, and what remains of America? Germany is the lymph. Italy is the bile. Shall we go into ecstasies over Russia? Voltaire admired it. He also admired China. I admit that Russia has its beauties, among others a stout despotism, but I pity the despots. Their health is delicate. A decapitated Alexis, a poignarded Peter, a strangled Paul, another Paul crushed flat with kicks, divers Ivans strangled with their throats cut, numerous Nicholases and Basils poisoned, all this indicates that the palace of the emperors of Russia is in a condition of flagrant insalubrity. All civilized peoples offer this detail to the admiration of the thinker. War. Now, war, civilized war, exhausts and sums up all the forms of ruffianism, from the brigandage of the Trabuceros in the gorges of Mount Jaxa to the marauding of the Comanche Indians in the Doubtful Pass. Bah, you will say to me, but Europe is certainly better than Asia. I admit that Asia is a farce, but I do not precisely see what you find to laugh at in the Grand Lama, you peoples of the West who have mingled with your fashions and your elegances all the complicated filth of majesty, from the dirty chemise of Queen Isabella to the chamber chair of the Dauphin. Gentlemen of the human race, I tell you, not a bit of it. It is at Brussels that the most beer is consumed, at Stockholm the most brandy, at Madrid the most chocolate, at Amsterdam the most gin, at London the most wine, at Constantinople the most coffee, at Paris the most absinthe. These are all the useful notions. Paris carries the day in short. In Paris, even the rag-pickers are sybarites. Diogenes would have loved to be a rag-picker of the Place Maubert better than to be a philosopher at the Piraeus. Learn this in addition. The wine shops of the rag-pickers are called bibines. The most celebrated are the Saucepan and the Slaughterhouse. Hence, tea gardens, goguettes, cabelots, boui-boui, mastroquet, basringues, manazang, bibines of the rag-pickers, caravanseries of the caliphs. I certify to you, I am a voluptuary. I eat at Richard's at 40 sous a head. I must have Persian carpets to roll naked Cleopatra in. Where is Cleopatra? Ah, so it is you, Louison. Good day. Thus did Grantaire, more than intoxicated, launch into speech, catching at the dishwasher in her passage from his corner in the back room of the Café Musain. Bossuet, extending his hand towards him, tried to impose silence on him, and Grantaire began again. worse than ever. Aigle de mots, down with your paws. You produce on me no effect with your gesture of Hippocrates refusing Artaxerxes' bric-a-brac. I excuse you from the task of soothing me. Moreover, I am sad. What do you wish me to say to you? Man is evil, man is deformed. The butterfly is a success. Man is a failure. God made a mistake with that animal. A crowd offers a choice of ugliness. The first comer is a wretch. Femme, woman, rhymes with infame, infamous. Yes, I have the spleen complicated with melancholy, with homesickness, plus hypochondria, and I am vexed, and I rage, and I yawn, and I am bored, and I am tired to death, and I am stupid. Let God go to the devil. Silence, then, capital R, resumed Bossuet, who was discussing a point of law behind the scenes, and who was plunged more than waist-high in a phrase of judicial slang, of which this is the conclusion. And as for me, although I am hardly a legist, and at the most an amateur attorney, I maintain this, that in accordance with the terms of the customs of Normandy, at Saint-Michel, and for each year, an equivalent must be paid to the profit of the lord of the manor, saving the rights of others, and by all and several the proprietors, as well as those seized with inheritance, and that, for all emphyteuses, leases, freeholds, contracts of domain, mortgages— Echo, plaintive nymph, hummed Grantaire. Near Grantaire, an almost silent table, a sheet of paper, an inkstand, and a pen between 2 glasses of brandy announced that a vaudeville was being sketched out. This great affair was being discussed in a low voice, and the 2 heads at work touched each other. Let us begin by finding names. When one has the names, one finds the subject. That is true. Dictate, I will write. Monsieur Dorimont. An independent gentleman? Of course. His daughter, Celestine. What next? Colonel Saint-Val. Saint-Val is stale. I should say Valsin. Beside the vaudeville aspirants, another group, which was also taking advantage of the uproar to talk low, was discussing a duel. An old fellow of 30 was counseling a young one of 18, and explaining to him what sort of an adversary he had to deal with. The deuce! Look out for yourself. He is a fine swordsman. His play is neat. He has the attack, no wasted feints, wrist, dash, lightning, a just parade, mathematical parries, bigre, and he is left-handed. In the angle opposite Grantaire, Joly and Bahorel were playing dominoes and talking of love. You are in luck, that you are, Joly was saying. You have a mistress who is always laughing. That is a fault of hers, returned Bahorel. One's mistress does wrong to laugh. That encourages one to deceive her. To see her gay removes your remorse. If you see her sad, your conscience pricks you. Ingrate! A woman who laughs is such a good thing, and you never quarrel. That is because of the treaty which we have made. On forming our little holy alliance, we assigned ourselves each our frontier, which we never cross. What is situated on the side of winter belongs to Vaud, on the side of the wind to Gex. Hence the peace. Peace is happiness digesting. And you, Joly, where do you stand in your entanglement with Mamselle? You know whom I mean. She sulks at me with cruel patience. Yet you are a lover to soften the heart with gauntness. Alas! In your place I would let her alone. That is easy enough to say. And to do. Is not her name Musiquette? Yes, my poor Bahorel, she is a superb girl, very literary, with tiny feet, little hands. She dresses well, and is white and dimpled, with the eyes of a fortune-teller. I am wild over her. My dear fellow, then in order to please her, you must be elegant, and produce effects with your knees. Buy a good pair of trousers of double-milled cloth at Staub's. That will assist. At what price? Shouted Grantaire. The third corner was delivered up to a poetical discussion. Pagan mythology was giving battle to Christian mythology. The question was about Olympus, whose part was taken by Jean Prouvaire out of pure romanticism. Jean Prouvaire was timid only in repose. Once excited, he burst forth. A sort of mirth accentuated his enthusiasm, and he was at once both laughing and lyric. Let us not insult the gods, said he. The gods may not have taken their departure. Jupiter does not impress me as dead. The gods are dreams, you say? Well, even in nature, such as it is today, after the flight of these dreams, we still find all the grand old pagan myths. Such and such a mountain with the profile of a citadel, like the Vigne Mall, for example, is still to me the headdress of Cybele. It has not been proved to me that Pan does not come at night to breathe into the hollow trunks of the willows, stopping up the holes in turn with his fingers, and I have always believed that Io had something to do with the cascade of Pisvache. In the last corner they were talking politics. The charter which had been granted was getting roughly handled. Combeferre was upholding it weakly. Courfeyrac was energetically making a breach in it. On the table lay an unfortunate copy of the famous Touquet Charter. Courfeyrac had seized it and was brandishing it, mingling with his arguments the rattling of this sheet of paper. In the first place, I won't have any kings. If it were only from an economical point of view, I don't want any. A king is a parasite. One does not have kings gratis. Listen to this, the dearness of kings. At the death of Francois I, the national debt of France amounted to an income of 30,000 livres. At the death of Louis XIV, it was 2 milliards, 600 millions, at 28 livres the mark, which was equivalent in 1760, according to Desmarais, to 4 milliards, 500 millions, which would today be equivalent to 12 milliards. In the second place, and no offense to Combeferre, a charter granted is but a poor expedient of civilization. To save the transition, to soften the passage, to deaden the shock, to cause the nation to pass insensibly from the monarchy to democracy by the practice of constitutional fictions. What detestable reasons all those are! No, no, let us never enlighten the people with false daylight. Principles dwindle and pale in your constitutional cellar. No illegitimacy, no compromise, no grant from the king to the people. In all such grants there is an Article 14. By the side of the hand which gives, there is the claw which snatches back. I refuse your charter point blank. A charter is a mask. The lie lurks beneath it. A people which accepts a charter abdicates. The law is only the law when entire. No, no charter. It was winter. A couple of faggots were crackling in the fireplace. This was tempting, and Courfeyrac could not resist. He crumpled the poor Touquet Charter in his fist and flung it in the fire. The paper flashed up. Combeferre watched the masterpiece of Louis XVIII burn philosophically and contented himself with saying, "The Charter metamorphosed into flame." And sarcasms, sallies, jests, that French thing which is called entrain and that English thing which is called humour, good and bad taste, good and bad reasons, all the wild pyrotechnics of dialogue, mounting together and crossing from all points of the room, produced a sort of merry bombardment over their heads. End of Book 4, Chapter 4. Book 4, The Friends of the ABC. Chapter 5, Enlargement of Horizon. The shocks of youthful minds among themselves have this admirable property, that one can never foresee the spark, nor divine the lightning flash. What will dart out presently, no one knows. The burst of laughter starts from a tender feeling. At the moment of jest, the serious makes its entry. Impulses depend on the first chance word. The spirit of each is sovereign. Jest suffices to open the field to the unexpected. These are conversations with abrupt turns, in which the perspective changes suddenly. Chance is the stage manager of such conversations. A severe thought, starting oddly from a clash of words, suddenly traversed the conflict of quips in which Grantaire, Bahorel, Prouvaire, Bossuet, Combeferre, and Courfeyrac were confusedly fencing. How does a phrase crop up in a dialogue? Whence comes it that it suddenly impresses itself on the attention of those who hear it? We have just said that no one knows anything about it. In the midst of the uproar, Bossuet all at once terminated some apostrophe to Combeferre with this date: June 18th, 1815, Waterloo. At this name of Waterloo, Marius, who was leaning his elbows on a table beside a glass of water, removed his wrist from beneath his chin and began to gaze fixedly at the audience. Pardieu! Exclaimed Courfeyrac. Parbleu was falling into disuse at this period. That number 18 is strange and strikes me. It is Bonaparte's fatal number. Place Louis in front and Brumaire behind, and you have the whole destiny of the man, with this significant peculiarity that the end treads close on the heels of the commencement. Enjolras, who had remained mute up to that point, broke the silence and addressed this remark to Combeferre. You mean to say the crime and the expiation. This word crime overpassed the measure of what Marius, who was already greatly agitated by the abrupt evocation of Waterloo, could accept. He rose, walked slowly to the map of France spread out on the wall, and at whose base an island was visible in a separate compartment, laid his finger on this compartment, and said, Corsica, a little island which has rendered France very great. This was like a breath of icy air. All ceased talking. They felt that something was on the point of occurring. Bahorel, replying to Bossuet, was just assuming an attitude of the torso to which he was addicted. He gave it up to listen. Enjolras, whose blue eye was not fixed on anyone, and who seemed to be gazing at space, replied, without glancing at Marius, France needs no Corsica to be great. France is great because she is France, quia nomina leo. Marius felt no desire to retreat. He turned towards Enjolras, and his voice burst forth with a vibration which came from a quiver of his very being. God forbid that I should diminish France, but amalgamating Napoleon with her is not diminishing her. Come, let us argue the question. I am a newcomer among you, but I will confess that you amaze me. Where do we stand? Who are we? Who are you? Who am I? Let us come to an explanation about the Emperor. I hear you say Buonaparte, accentuating the you like the royalists. I warn you that my grandfather does better still. He says Buonaparte. I thought you were young men. Where then is your enthusiasm? And what are you doing with it? Whom do you admire if you do not admire the Emperor? And what more do you want? If you will have none of that great man, what great man would you like? He had everything. He was complete. He had in his brain the sum of human faculties. He made codes like Justinian. He dictated like Caesar. His conversation was mingled with the lightning flash of Pascal, with the thunderclap of Tacitus. He made history and he wrote it. His bulletins are Iliads. He combined the cipher of Newton with the metaphor of Mahomet. He left behind him in the East words as great as the pyramids. At Tilsit he taught emperors majesty. At the Academy of Sciences he replied to Laplace. In the Council of State he held his own against Merlin. He gave a soul to the geometry of the first and to the chicanery of the last. He was a legist with the attorneys and sidereal with the astronomers. Like Cromwell blowing out one of two candles, he went to the temple to bargain for a curtain tassel. He saw everything. He knew everything, which did not prevent him from laughing good-naturedly beside the cradle of his little child. And all at once frightened Europe lent an ear, armies put themselves in motion, parks of artillery rumbled, pontoons stretched over the rivers, clouds of cavalry galloped in the storm, cries, trumpets, a trembling of thrones in every direction. The frontiers of kingdoms oscillated on the map. The sound of a superhuman sword was heard as it was drawn from its sheath. They beheld him, rise erect on the horizon with a blazing brand in his hand and a glow in his eyes, unfolding amid the thunder his two wings, the Grand Army and the Old Guard, and he was the Archangel of War. All held their peace, and Enjolras bowed his head. Silence always produces somewhat the effect of acquiescence, of the enemy being driven to the wall. Marius continued with increased enthusiasm, and almost without pausing for breath. Let us be just, my friends. What a splendid destiny for a nation to be the empire of such an emperor, when that nation is France, and when it adds its own genius to the genius of that man. To appear and to reign, to march and to triumph, to have for halting places all capitals, to take his grenadiers and to make kings of them, to decree the falls of dynasties, and to transfigure Europe at the pace of a charge, to make you feel that when you threaten you lay your hand on the hilt of the sword of God, to follow in a single man Hannibal, Caesar, Charlemagne, to be the people of some one who mingles with your dawns the startling announcement of a battle won, to have the cannon of the Invalides to rouse you in the morning, to hurl you into abysses of light prodigious words which flame forever, Marengo, Arcola, Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, to cause constellations of victories to flash forth at each instant from the zenith of the centuries, to make the French Empire a pendant to the Roman Empire, to be the great nation and to give birth to the grand army, to make its legions fly forth over all the earth, as a mountain sends out its eagles on all sides to conquer, to dominate, to strike with lightning, to be in Europe a sort of nation gilded through glory, to sound athwart the centuries a trumpet blast of Titans, to conquer the world twice, by conquest and by dazzling. That is sublime, and what greater thing is there? To be free, said Combeferre. Marius lowered his head in his turn. That cold and simple word had traversed his epic effusion like a blade of steel, and he felt it vanishing within him. When he raised his eyes, Combeferre was no longer there. Probably satisfied with his reply to the apotheosis, he had just taken his departure, and all, with the exception of Enjolras, had followed him. The room had been emptied. Enjolras, left alone with Marius, was gazing gravely at him. Marius, however, having rallied his ideas to some extent, did not consider himself beaten. There lingered in him a trace of inward fermentation, which was on the point, no doubt, of translating itself into syllogisms arrayed against Enjolras, when, all of a sudden, they heard someone singing on the stairs as he went. It was Combeferre, and this is what he was singing. Si César m'avait donné la gloire et la guerre, et qu'il me fallait quitter l'amour de ma mère, je dirais au grand César, reprends ton sceptre et ton char. J'aime mieux ma mère, ô Gué, j'aime mieux ma mère. The wild and tender accents with which Combeferre sang communicated to this couplet a sort of strange grandeur. Marius, thoughtfully, and with his eyes diked on the ceiling, repeated almost mechanically, "My mother?" At that moment he felt Enjolras' hand on his shoulder. "Citizen," said Enjolras to him, "my mother is the Republic." End of Book 4, Chapter 5.
Book 4, Les Misérables, Chapter 6, Res Angusta. That evening left Marius profoundly shaken, and with a melancholy shadow in his soul. He felt what the earth may possibly feel at the moment when it is torn open with the iron, in order that grain may be deposited within it. It feels only the wound. The quiver of the germ and the joy of the fruit only arrive later. Marius was gloomy. He had but just acquired a faith. Must he then reject it already? He affirmed to himself that he would not. He declared to himself that he would not doubt. And he began to doubt, in spite of himself. To stand between two religions, from one of which you have not as yet emerged, and another into which you have not yet entered, is intolerable. And twilight is pleasing only to bat-like souls. Marius was clear-eyed, and he required the true light. The half-lights of doubt pained him. Whatever may have been his desire to remain where he was, he could not halt there. He was irresistibly constrained to continue, to advance, to examine, to think, to march further. Whither would this lead him? He feared, after having taken so many steps which had brought him nearer to his father, to now take a step which should estrange him from that father. His discomfort was augmented by all the reflections which occurred to him. An escarpment rose around him. He was in accord neither with his grandfather nor with his friends. Daring in the eyes of the one, he was behind the times in the eyes of the other. And he recognized the fact that he was doubly isolated, on the side of age and on the side of youth. He ceased to go to the Café Musain. In the troubled state of his conscience, he no longer thought of certain serious sides of existence. The realities of life do not allow themselves to be forgotten. They soon elbowed him abruptly. One morning the proprietor of the hotel entered Marius's room and said to him, "Monsieur Courfeyrac answered for you." "Yes, but I must have my money." "Request Courfeyrac to come and talk with me," said Marius. Courfeyrac having made his appearance, the host left them. Marius then told him what it had not before occurred to him to relate, that he was the same as alone in the world, and had no relatives. "What is to become of you?" said Courfeyrac. "I do not know in the least," replied Marius. "What are you going to do?" "I do not know." "Have you any money?" 15 francs. "Do you want me to lend you some?" "Never." "Have you clothes?" "Here is what I have." "Have you trinkets?" "A watch." "Silver?" "Gold. Here it is." "I know a clothes dealer who will take your frock coat and a pair of trousers." "That is good." "You will then have only a pair of trousers, a waistcoat, a hat, and a coat." "And my boots." "What? You will not go barefoot? What opulence!" "That will be enough." "I know a watchmaker who will buy your watch." "That is good." "No, it is not good. What will you do after that?" "Whatever is necessary. Anything honest, that is to say." "Do you know English?" "No." "Do you know German?" "No." "So much the worse." "Why?" "Because one of my friends, a publisher, is getting up a sort of an encyclopedia, for which you might have translated English or German articles. It is badly paid work, but one can live by it." "I will learn English and German." "And in the meanwhile?" "In the meanwhile I will live on my clothes and my watch." The clothes dealer was sent for. He paid 20 francs for the cast-off garments. They went to the watchmaker's. He bought the watch for 45 francs. "That is not bad," said Marius to Courfeyrac on their return to the hotel. "With my 15 francs that makes 80. "And the hotel bill," observed Courfeyrac. "Hello, I had forgotten that," said Marius. The landlord presented his bill, which had to be paid on the spot. It amounted to 70 francs. "I have 10 francs left," said Marius. "The deuce!" exclaimed Courfeyrac. "You will eat up 5 francs while you are learning English, and 5 while learning German. That will be swallowing a tongue very fast, or 100 sous very slowly." In the meantime, Aunt Gillenormand, a rather good-hearted person at bottom in difficulties, had finally hunted up Marius's abode. One morning, on his return from the law school, Marius found a letter from his aunt, and the 60 pistoles, that is to say 600 francs in gold, in a sealed box. Marius sent back the 30 louis to his aunt, with a respectful letter, in which he stated that he had sufficient means of subsistence, and that he should be able thenceforth to supply all his needs. At that moment he had 3 francs left. His aunt did not inform his grandfather of this refusal, for fear of exasperating him. Besides, had he not said, "Let me never hear the name of that blood-drinker again"? Marius left the Hotel de la Porte Saint-Jacques, as he did not wish to run in debt there. End of Book 4, Chapter 6.
Book 5, Les Misérables, Chapter 1, Marius Indigent. Life became hard for Marius. It was nothing to eat his clothes and his watch. He ate of that terrible, inexpressible thing that is called de la vache en rage. That is to say, he endured great hardships and privations. A terrible thing it is, containing days without bread, nights without sleep, evenings without a candle, a hearth without a fire, weeks without work, a future without hope, a coat out at the elbows, an old hat which evokes the laughter of young girls, a door which one finds locked on one at night because one's rent is not paid, the insolence of the porter and the cook-shop man, the sneers of neighbors, humiliations, dignity trampled on, work of whatever nature accepted, disgust, bitterness, despondency. Marius learned how all this is eaten, and how such are often the only things which one has to devour. At that moment of his existence when a man needs his pride because he needs love, he felt that he was jeered at because he was badly dressed and ridiculous because he was poor. At the age when youth swells the heart with imperial pride, he dropped his eyes more than once on his dilapidated boots, and he knew the unjust shame and the poignant blushes of wretchedness. Admirable and terrible trial, from which the feeble emerge base, from which the strong emerge sublime. A crucible into which destiny casts a man, whenever it desires a scoundrel or a demagogue. For many great deeds are performed in petty combats. There are instances of bravery ignored and obstinate, which defend themselves step by step in that fatal onslaught of necessities and turpitudes. Noble and mysterious triumphs which no eye beholds, which are requited with no renown, which are saluted with no trumpet blast. Life, misfortune, isolation, abandonment, poverty, are fields of battle which have their heroes, obscure heroes who are sometimes grander than the heroes who win renown. Firm and rare natures are thus created. Misery, almost always a stepmother, is sometimes a mother. Destitution gives birth to might of soul and spirit. Distress is the nurse of pride. Unhappiness is a good milk for the magnanimous. There came a moment in Marius' life when he swept his own landing, when he bought his sou's worth of brie cheese at the fruiterer's, when he waited until twilight had fallen to slip into the baker's and purchase a loaf, which he carried off furtively to his attic as though he had stolen it. Sometimes there could be seen gliding into the butcher's shop on the corner, in the midst of the bantering cooks who elbowed him, an awkward young man, carrying big books under his arm, who had a timid yet angry air, who on entering removed his hat from a brow whereon stood drops of perspiration, made a profound bow to the butcher's astonished wife, asked for a mutton cutlet, paid 6 or 7 sous for it, wrapped it up in a paper, put it under his arm between 2 books, and went away. It was Marius. On this cutlet, which he cooked for himself, he lived for 3 days. On the first day he ate the meat. On the second he ate the fat. On the third he gnawed the bone. Aunt Gillenormand made repeated attempts, and sent him the 60 pistoles several times. Marius returned them on every occasion, saying that he needed nothing. He was still in mourning for his father when the revolution which we have just described was effected within him. From that time forth he had not put off his black garments, but his garments were quitting him. The day came when he had no longer a coat. The trousers would go next. What was to be done? Courfeyrac, to whom he had on his side done some good turns, gave him an old coat. For 30 sous Marius got it turned by some porter or other, and it was a new coat. But this coat was green. Then Marius ceased to go out until after nightfall. This made his coat black. As he wished always to appear in mourning, he clothed himself with the night. In spite of all this, he got admitted to practice as a lawyer. He was supposed to live in Courfeyrac's room, which was decent, and where a certain number of law books, backed up and completed by several dilapidated volumes of romance, passed as the library required by the regulations. He had his letters addressed to Courfeyrac's quarters. When Marius became a lawyer, he informed his grandfather of the fact in a letter which was cold but full of submission and respect. M. Gillenormand trembled as he took the letter, read it, tore it in 4 pieces, and threw it into the wastebasket. 2 or 3 days later, Mademoiselle Gillenormand heard her father, who was alone in his room, talking aloud to himself. He always did this whenever he was greatly agitated. She listened, and the old man was saying, If you were not a fool, you would know that one cannot be a baron and a lawyer at the same time.
Chapter 2. Marius Poor. It is the same with wretchedness as with everything else. It ends by becoming bearable. It finally assumes a form, and adjusts itself. One vegetates, that is to say. One develops in a certain meagre fashion, which is, however, sufficient for life. This is the mode in which the existence of Marius Pontmercy was arranged. He had passed the worst straits, the narrow pass was opening out a little in front of him. By dint of toil, perseverance, courage, and will, he had managed to draw from his work about 700 francs a year. He had learned German and English, thanks to Courfeyrac, who had put him in communication with his friend, the publisher. Marius filled the modest post of utility man in literature at the publishing house. He drew prospectuses, translated newspapers, annotated editions, compiled biographies, etc. Net product, year in and year out, 700 francs. He lived on it. How? Not so badly. We will explain. Marius occupied in the Gorbeau house, for an annual sum of 30 francs, a den minus a fireplace, called the cabinet, which contained only the most indispensable articles of furniture. This furniture belonged to him. He gave 3 francs a month to the old principal tenant to come and sweep his hole, and to bring him a little hot water every morning, a fresh egg, and a penny roll. He breakfasted on his egg and roll. His breakfast varied in cost from 2 to 4 sous, according as eggs were dear or cheap. At 6 o'clock in the evening he descended the Rue Saint-Jacques, to dine at Rousseau's, opposite Basset's, the stamp dealer's, on the corner of Rue des Mathurins. He ate no soup. He took a 6 sous plate of meat, half portion of vegetables for 3 sous, and 3 sous dessert. For 3 sous he got as much bread as he wished. As for wine, he drank water. When he paid at the desk when Madame Rousseau, at that period still plump and rosy, majestically presided, he gave a sou to the waiter, and Madame Rousseau gave him a smile. Then he went away. For 16 sous he had a smile and a dinner. This restaurant Rousseau, where so few bottles and so many water carafes were emptied, was a calming potion rather than a restaurant. It no longer exists. The proprietor had a fine nickname. He was called Rousseau the Aquatic. Thus breakfast 4 sous, dinner 16 sous. His food cost him 20 sous a day, which made 365 francs a year. Add the 30 francs for rent, and 36 francs to the old woman, plus a few trifling expenses. With 450 francs, Marius was fed, lodged, and waited on. His clothing cost him 100 francs, his linen 50 francs, his washing 50 francs. The whole did not exceed 650 francs. He was rich. He sometimes lent 10 francs to a friend. Courfeyrac had once been able to borrow 60 francs from him. As far as fire was concerned, as Marius had no fireplace, he had simplified matters. Marius always had 2 complete suits of clothes, the one old for every day, the other brand new for special occasions. Both were black. He had but 3 shirts, one on his person, the second in the commode, and the third in the washwoman's hands. He renewed them as they wore out. They were always ragged, which caused him to button his coat to the chin. It had required years for Marius to attain this flourishing condition. Hard years, difficult, some of them, to traverse, others to climb. Marius had not failed for a single day. He had endured everything in the way of destitution. He had done everything except contract debts. He did himself the justice to say that he had never owed anyone a sou. A debt was, to him, the beginning of slavery. He even said to himself that a creditor is worse than a master, for the master possesses only a person, a creditor possesses your dignity, and can administer to it a box on the ear. Rather than borrow, he went without food. He had passed many a day fasting, feeling that all extremes meet, and that, if one is not on one's guard, lowered fortunes may lead to baseness of soul. He kept a jealous watch on his pride. such a formality of action, which, in any other situation, would have appeared merely deference to him, now seemed insipidity, and he nerved himself against it. His face wore a sort of severe flush. He was timid even to rudeness. During all these trials he had felt himself encouraged and even uplifted, at times, by a secret force that he possessed within himself. The soul aids the body, and at certain moments erases it. It is the only bird that bears up its own cage. Besides his father's name, another name was graven in Marius' heart, the name of Thénardier. Marius, with his grave enthusiastic nature, surrounded with a sort of aureole the man to whom, in his thought, he owed his father's life, that intrepid sergeant who had saved the colonel amid the bullets and the cannon balls at Waterloo. He never separated the memory of this man from the memory of his father, and he associated them with his veneration. It was a sort of worship in two steps, with a grand altar for the colonel and the lesser one for Thénardier. What redoubled the tenderness of this gratitude towards Thénardier was the idea of distress into which he knew that Thénardier had fallen, and which had engulfed the latter. Marius had learned at Montfermeil of the ruin and bankruptcy of the unfortunate innkeeper. Since that time he had made unheard of efforts to find traces of him, and to reach him in that dark abyss of misery in which Thénardier had disappeared. Marius had beaten the whole country. He had gone to Chelles, to Bondy, to Gournay, to Nogent, to Lagny. He had persisted for 3 years, expending in these explorations little money which he had laid by. No one had been able to give him any news of Thénardier. He was supposed to have gone abroad. His creditors had also sought him, with less love than Marius, but with as much assiduity, and had not been able to lay their hands on him. Marius blamed himself, and was almost angry with himself for his lack of success in his researches. It was the only debt left him by the colonel, and Marius made it a matter of honour to pay it. What, he thought, when my father lay dying on the field of battle, did Thénardier contrive to find him amid the smoke in a grape shot, and bear him off on his shoulders, and yet he owed him nothing, and I, who owe so much to Thénardier, cannot join him in this shadow where he is lying with the pangs of death, and in my turn bring him back from death to life. Oh, I will find him. To find Thénardier, in fact, Marius would have given one of his arms. To rescue him from his misery, he would have sacrificed all his blood. To see Thénardier, to render Thénardier some service, to say to him, "You do not know me, well, I do know you. Here I am, dispose of me." This was Marius' sweetest and most magnificent dream. End of chapter 2. Recording by April Gonzalez in Cavite, Philippines.
Book 5. The Excellence of Misfortune. Chapter 3. Marius grown up. At this epoch, Marius was 20 years of age. It was 3 years since he had left his grandfather. Both parties had remained on the same terms, without attempting to approach each other and without seeking to see each other. Besides, what was the use of seeing each other? Marius was the brass vase, while Father Gillenormand was the iron pot. We admit that Marius was mistaken as to his grandfather's heart. He had imagined that Monsieur Gillenormand had never loved him, and that that crusty, harsh, and smiling old fellow, who cursed, shouted, and stormed, and brandished his cane, cherished for him, at the most, only that affection which is at once slight and severe, of the dotards of comedy. Marius was in error. There are fathers who do not love their children. There exists no grandfather who does not adore his grandson. At bottom, as we have said, Monsieur Gillenormand idolized Marius. He idolized him after his own fashion, with an accompaniment of snappishness and boxes on the ear, but, this child once gone, he felt a black void in his heart. He would allow no one to mention the child to him, and all the while secretly regretted that he was so well obeyed. At first, he hoped that this Bonapartist, this Jacobin, this terrorist, this Septemberist would return. But the weeks passed by, years passed. To M. Gillenormand's great despair, the blood drinker did not make his appearance. I could not do otherwise than turn him out, said the grandfather to himself, and he asked himself, if the thing were to do over again, would I do it? His pride instantly answered yes, but his aged head, which he shook in silence, replied sadly no. He had his hours of depression. He missed Marius. Old men need affection as they need the sun. It is warmth. Strong as his nature was, the absence of Marius had wrought some change in him. Nothing in the world could have induced him to take a step towards that rogue, but he suffered. He never inquired about him, but he thought of him incessantly. He lived in the Marais in a more and more retired manner. He was still merry and violent as of old, but his merriment had a convulsive harshness, and his violences always terminated in a sort of gentle and gloomy dejection. He sometimes said, "Oh, if only he would return, what a good box on the ear I would give him." As for his aunt, she thought too little to love much. Marius was no longer for her much more than a vague black form, and she eventually came to occupy herself with him much less than with the cat or the paroquet which she probably had. What augmented Father Gillenormand's secret suffering was, that he locked it all up within his breast, and did not allow its existence to be divined. His sorrow was like those recently invented furnaces, which consume their own smoke. It sometimes happened that officious busybodies spoke to him of Marius, and asked him, "What is your grandson doing? What has become of him?" The old bourgeois replied with a sigh, that he was a sad case, and giving a fillip to his cuff, if he wished to appear gay, "Monsieur le Baron de Pontmercy is practising pettifogging in some corner or other." While the old man regretted, Marius applauded himself. As is the case with all good-hearted people, misfortune had eradicated his bitterness. He thought only of M. Gillenormand in an amiable light, but he had set his mind on not receiving anything more from the man who had been unkind to his father. This was the mitigated translation of his first indignation. Moreover, he was happy at having suffered, and at suffering still. It was for his father's sake. The hardness of his life satisfied and pleased him. He said to himself with a sort of joy that it was certainly the least he could do, that it was an expiation, that, had it not been for that, he would have been punished in some other way, and later on, for his impious indifference towards his father, and such a father. That it would not have been just that his father should have all the suffering and he none of it. And that, in any case, what were his toils and his destitution compared with the colonel's heroic life? That, in short, the only way for him to approach his father and resemble him was to be brave in the face of indigence, as the other had been valiant before the enemy, and that was, no doubt, what the colonel had meant to imply by the words, "He will be worthy of it," words which Marius continued to wear, not on his breast, since the colonel's writing had disappeared, but in his heart. And then, on the day when his grandfather had turned him out of doors, he had been only a child, now he was a man. He felt it. Misery, we repeat, had been good for him. Poverty in youth, when it succeeds, has this magnificent property about it, that it turns the whole will towards effort, and the whole soul towards aspiration. Poverty instantly lays material life bare, and renders it hideous. Hence, inexpressible bounds towards the ideal life. The wealthy young man has 100 coarse and brilliant distractions: horse races, hunting, dogs, tobacco, gaming, good repasts, and all the rest of it. Occupations for the baser side of the soul, at the expense of the loftier and more delicate sides. The poor young man wins his bread with difficulty. He eats. When he has eaten, he has nothing more but meditation. He goes to the spectacles which God furnishes gratis. He gazes at the sky, space, the stars, flowers, children, the humanity among which he is suffering, the creation amid which he beams. He gazes so much on humanity that he perceives its soul. He gazes upon creation to such an extent that he beholds God. He dreams, he feels himself great, he dreams on, and feels himself tender. From the egotism of the man who suffers, he passes to the compassion of the man who meditates. An admirable sentiment breaks forth in him, forgetfulness of self and pity for all. As he thinks of the innumerable enjoyments which nature offers, gives, and lavishes to the souls which stand open, and refuses to souls that are closed, he comes to pity, he, the millionaire of the mind, the millionaire of money. All hatred departs from his heart in proportion as light penetrates his spirit. And is he unhappy? No. The misery of a young man is never miserable. The first young lad who comes to hand, however poor he may be, with his strength, his health, his rapid walk, his brilliant eyes, his warmly circulating blood, his black hair, his red lips, his white teeth, his pure breath, will always arouse the envy of an aged emperor. And then, every morning, he sets himself afresh to the task of earning his bread, and while his hands earn his bread, his dorsal column gains pride, his brain gathers ideas. His task is finished, he returns to ineffable ecstasies, to contemplation, to joys. He beholds his feet set in afflictions, in obstacles on the pavement, in the nettles, sometimes in the mire, his head in the light. He is firm, serene, gentle, peaceful, attentive, serious, content with little, kindly, and he thanks God for having bestowed on him those two forms of riches which many a rich man lacks: work, which makes him free, and thought, which makes him dignified. This is what happened with Marius. To tell the truth, he inclined a little too much to the side of contemplation. From the day when he had succeeded in earning his living with some approach to certainty, he had stopped, thinking it good to be poor, and retrenching time from his work to give to thought, that is to say, he sometimes passed entire days in meditation, absorbed, engulfed, like a visionary, in the mute voluptuousness of ecstasy and inward radiance. He had thus propounded the problem of his life, to toil as little as possible at material labour, in order to toil as much as possible at the labour which is impalpable. In other words, to bestow a few hours on real life, and to cast the rest to the infinite. As he believed that he lacked nothing, he did not perceive that contemplation, thus understood, ends by becoming one of the forms of idleness, that he was contenting himself with conquering the first necessities of life, and that he was resting from his labours too soon. It was evident that, for this energetic and enthusiastic nature, this could only be a transitory state, and that, at the first shock against the inevitable complications of destiny, Marius would awaken. In the meantime, although he was a lawyer, and whatever Father Gillenormand thought about the matter, he was not practising, he was not even pettifogging. Meditation had turned him aside from pleading. To haunt attorneys, to follow the court, to hunt up cases, what a bore! Why should he do it? He saw no reason for changing the matter of gaining his livelihood. The obscure and ill-paid publishing establishment had come to mean for him a sure source of work which did not involve too much labour, as we have explained, and which sufficed for his wants. One of the publishers for whom he worked, Monsieur Magimel, I think, offered to take him into his own house, to lodge him well, to furnish him with regular occupation, and to give him 1,500 francs a year. To be well lodged, 1,500 francs, no doubt, but renounce his liberty, be fixed on wages, a sort of hired man of letters. According to Marius's opinion, if he accepted, his position would become both better and worse at the same time. He acquired comfort and lost his dignity. It was a fine and complete unhappiness converted into a repulsive and ridiculous state of torture. Something like the case of a blind man who should recover the sight of one eye. He refused. Marius dwelt in solitude. Owing to his taste for remaining outside of everything, and through having been too much alarmed, he had not entered decidedly into the group presided over by Enjolras. They had remained good friends. They were ready to assist each other on occasion in every possible way, but nothing more. Marius had two friends, one young, Courfeyrac, and one old, Monsieur Mabeuf. He inclined more to the old man. In the first place, he owed to him the revolution which had taken place within him. To him he was indebted for having known and loved his father. He operated on me for a cataract, he said. The churchwarden certainly played a decisive part. It was not, however, that Monsieur Mabeuf had been anything but the calm and impassive agent of Providence in this connection. He had enlightened Marius by chance, and without being aware of the fact, as does a candle which someone brings. He had been the candle, and not the someone. As for Marius's inward political revolution, Monsieur Mabeuf was totally incapable of comprehending it, of willing or of directing it. As we shall see Monsieur Mabeuf again later on, a few words will not be superfluous. End of Book 5, Chapter 3. Book 5. The Excellence of Misfortune. Chapter 4. Monsieur Mabeuf. On the day when Monsieur Mabeuf said to Marius, "Certainly I approve of political opinions," he expressed the real state of his mind. All political opinions were matters of indifference to him, and he approved them all, without distinction, provided they left him in peace, as the Greeks called the Furies, the beautiful, the good, the charming, the Eumenides. Monsieur Mabeuf's political opinion consisted in a passionate love for plants, and above all, for books. Like all the rest of the world, he possessed the termination in "ist," without which no one could exist at that time. But he was neither a royalist, a Bonapartist, a Chartist, an Orleanist, nor an anarchist. He was a bouquinist, a collector of old books. He did not understand how men could busy themselves with hating each other because of silly stuff like the Charter, democracy, legitimacy, monarchy, the Republic, etc., when there were in the world all sorts of mosses, grasses, and shrubs which they might be looking at, and heaps of folios, and even of 32 mots, which they might turn over. He took good care not to become useless. Having books did not prevent his reading, being a botanist did not prevent his being a gardener. When he made Pontmercy's acquaintance, this sympathy had existed between the colonel and himself. That what the colonel did for flowers, he did for fruits. Monsieur Mabeuf had succeeded in producing seedling pears, as savoury as the pears of Saint-Germain. It is from one of his combinations, apparently, that the October Mirabelle, now celebrated and no less perfumed than the summer Mirabelle, owes its origin. He went to mass rather from gentleness than from piety, and because, as he loved the faces of men but hated their noise, he found them assembled and silent only in church. Feeling that he must be something in the state, he had chosen the career of warden. However, he had never succeeded in loving any woman as much as a tulip bulb, nor any man as much as an Elzevir. He had long passed 60 when, one day, someone asked him, "Have you never been married?" "I have forgotten," said he. When it sometimes happened to him, and to whom does it not happen, to say, "Oh, if I were only rich," it was not when ogling a pretty girl, as was the case with Father Gillenormand, but when contemplating an old book. He lived alone with an old housekeeper. He was somewhat gouty, and when he was asleep, his aged fingers, stiffened with rheumatism, lay crooked up in the folds of his sheets. He had composed and published a Flora of the Environs of Cauteretz, with coloured plates, a work which enjoyed a tolerable measure of esteem and which sold well. People rang his bell in the Rue Mésières 2 or 3 times a day to ask for it. He drew as much as 2,000 francs a year from it. This constituted nearly the whole of his fortune. Although poor, he had had the talent to form for himself, by dint of patience, privations, and time, a precious collection of rare copies of every sort. He never went out without a book under his arm, and he often returned with 2. The sole decoration of the 4 rooms on the ground floor which composed his lodgings consisted of framed herbariums and engravings of the old masters. The sight of a sword or a gun chilled his blood. He had never approached a cannon in his life, even at the Invalides. He had a passable stomach, a brother who was a cure, perfectly white hair, no teeth, either in his mouth or his mind, a trembling in every limb, a Picard accent, an infantile laugh, the air of an old sheep, and he was easily frightened. Add to this, that he had no other friendship, no other acquaintance among the living than an old bookseller of the Porte Saint-Jacques named Royal. His dream was to naturalize indigo in France. His servant was also a sort of innocent. The poor good old woman was a spinster. Sultan, her cat, which might have mewed Allegri's Misérables in the Sixtine Chapel, had filled her heart and sufficed for the quantity of passion which existed in her. None of her dreams had ever proceeded as far as a man. She had never been able to get further than her cat. Like him, she had a moustache. Her glory consisted in her caps, which were always white. She passed her time, on Sundays, after Mass, in counting over the linen in her chest, and in spreading out on her bed the dresses in the piece which she bought and had never made up. She knew how to read. Monsieur Mabeuf had nicknamed her Mother Plutarque. Monsieur Mabeuf had taken a fancy to Marius, because Marius, being young and gentle, warmed his age without startling his timidity. Youth combined with gentleness produces on old people the effect of the sun without wind. When Marius was saturated with military glory, with gunpowder, with marches and counter-marches, and with all those prodigious battles in which his father had given and received such tremendous blows of the sword, he went to see Monsieur Mabeuf, and Monsieur Mabeuf talked to him of his hero from the point of view of flowers. His brother the curé died about 1830, and almost immediately, as when the night is drawing on, the whole horizon grew dark for Monsieur Mabeuf. A notary's failure deprived him of the sum of 10,000 francs, which was all that he possessed in his brother's right and his own. The Revolution of July brought a crisis to publishing. In a period of embarrassment, the first thing which does not sell is a flora. The flora of the environs of Cauteretz stopped short. Weeks passed by without a single purchaser. Sometimes Monsieur Mabeuf started at the sound of the bell. "Monsieur," said Mother Plutarque sadly, "it is the water carrier." In short, one day, Monsieur Mabeuf quitted the Rue Mésières, abdicated the functions of warden, gave up Saint-Sulpice, sold not a part of his books, but of his prints, that to which he was least attached, and installed himself in a little house on the Rue Montparnasse, where, however, he remained but 1/4 for 2 reasons. In the first place, the ground floor and the garden cost 300 francs, and he dared not spend more than 200 francs on his rent. In the second, being near Faton's shooting gallery, he could hear the pistol shots, which was intolerable to him. He carried off his flora, his copper plates, his herbariums, his portfolios, and his books, and established himself near the Salpêtrière, in a sort of thatched cottage of the village of Austerlitz, where, for 50 crowns a year, he got 3 rooms and a garden, enclosed by a hedge, and containing a well. He took advantage of this removal to sell off nearly all his furniture. On the day of his entrance into his new quarters, he was very gay, and drove the nails on which his engravings and herbariums were to hang, with his own hands, dug in his garden the rest of the day, and at night, perceiving that Mother Plutarque had a melancholy air, and was very thoughtful, he tapped her on the shoulder and said to her with a smile, "We have the indigo." Only 2 visitors, the bookseller of the Porte Saint-Jacques and Marius, were admitted to view the thatched cottage at Austerlitz, a brawling name which was, to tell the truth, extremely disagreeable to him. However, as we have just pointed out, brains which are absorbed in some bit of wisdom or folly, or, as it often happens, in both at once, are but slowly accessible to the things of actual life. Their own destiny is a far-off thing to them. There results from such concentration a passivity which, if it were the outcome of reasoning, would resemble philosophy. One declines, descends, trickles away, even crumbles away, and yet is hardly conscious of it oneself. It always ends, it is true, in an awakening, but the awakening is tardy. In the meantime, it seems as though we held ourselves neutral in the game which is going on between our happiness and our unhappiness. We are the stake, and we look on at the game with indifference. It is thus that, athwart the cloud which formed about him, when all his hopes were extinguished one after the other, Monsieur Mabeuf remained rather puerilely, but profoundly serene. His habits of mind had the regular swing of a pendulum. Once mounted on an illusion, he went for a very long time, even after the illusion had disappeared. A clock does not stop short at the precise moment when the key is lost. Monsieur Mabeuf had his innocent pleasures. These pleasures were inexpensive and unexpected. The merest chance furnished them. One day, Mother Plutarque was reading a romance in one corner of the room. She was reading aloud, finding that she understood better thus. To read aloud is to assure oneself of what one is reading. There are people who read very loud, and who have the appearance of giving themselves their word of honour as to what they are perusing. It was with this sort of energy that Mother Plutarque was reading the romance which she had in hand. Monsieur Mabeuf heard her without listening to her. In the course of her reading, Mother Plutarque came to this phrase. It was a question of an officer of dragoons and a beauty. The beauty pouted, and the dragoon. Here she interrupted herself to wipe her glasses. Buddha and the dragon, struck in Monsieur Mabeuf in a low voice. Yes, it is true that there was a dragon which, from the depths of its cave, spouted flame through his maw and set the heavens on fire. Many stars had already been consumed by this monster, which, besides, had the claws of a tiger. Buddha went into its den and succeeded in converting the dragon. That is a good book that you are reading, Mother Plutarque. There is no more beautiful legend in existence. And Monsieur Mabeuf fell into a delicious reverie. End of Book 5, Chapter 4.
Book number 5, The Excellence of Misfortune. Chapter 5, Poverty, a Good Neighbor for Misery. Marius liked this candid old man who saw himself gradually falling into the clutches of indigence, and who came to feel astonishment, little by little, without, however, being made melancholy by it. Marius met Courfeyrac and sought out Monsieur Mabeuf, very rarely, however, twice a month at most. Marius' pleasure consisted in taking long walks alone on the outer boulevards, or in the Champs de Mars, or in the least frequented alleys of the Luxembourg. He often spent half a day in gazing at a market garden, the beds of lettuce, the chickens on the dung heap, the horse turning the water wheel. The passers-by stared at him in surprise, and some of them thought his attire suspicious and his mien sinister. He was only a poor young man, dreaming in an objectless way. It was during one of his strolls that he hit upon the Gorbeau house, and tempted by its isolation and its cheapness, had taken up his abode there. He was known there only under the name of Monsieur Marius. Some of his father's old generals or old comrades had invited him to go and see them when they learned about him. Marius had not refused their invitations. They afforded opportunities of talking about his father. Thus he went from time to time to Comte Pajol, to General Bellavesne, to General Fririon, to the Invalides. There was music and dancing there. On such evenings Marius put on his new coat. But he never went to these evening parties or balls, except on days when it was freezing cold, because he could not afford a carriage, and he did not wish to arrive with boots otherwise than like mirrors. He said sometimes, but without bitterness, men are so made that in a drawing-room you may be soiled everywhere except on your shoes. In order to ensure a good reception there, only one irreproachable thing is asked of you. Your conscience? No. Your boots. All passions, except those of the heart, are dissipated by reverie. Marius' political fevers vanished thus. The revolution of 1830 assisted in the process by satisfying and calming him. He remained the same, setting aside his fits of wrath. He still held the same opinions, only they had been tempered. To speak accurately, he had no longer any opinions, he had sympathies. To what party did he belong? To the party of humanity. Out of humanity he chose France. Out of the nation he chose the people. Out of the people he chose the woman. It was to that point above all that his pity was directed. Now he preferred an idea to a deed, a poet to a hero. And he admired a book like Job more than an event like Marengo. And then when, after a day spent in meditation, he returned in the evening through the boulevards and caught a glimpse through the branches of the trees of the fathomless space beyond, the nameless gleams, the abyss, the shadow, the mystery, all that which is only human seemed very pretty indeed to him. He thought that he had, and he really had in fact, arrived at the truth of life and of human philosophy, and he had ended by gazing at nothing but heaven, the only thing which truth can perceive from the bottom of her well. This did not prevent him from multiplying his plans, his combinations, his scaffoldings, his projects for the future. In this state of reverie, an eye which could have cast a glance into Marius' interior would have been dazzled with the purity of that soul. In fact, had it been given to our eyes of the flesh to gaze into the consciousnesses of others, we should be able to judge a man much more surely according to what he dreams than according to what he thinks. There is will in thought, there is none in dreams. Reverie, which is utterly spontaneous, takes and keeps, even in the gigantic and the ideal, the form of our spirit. Nothing proceeds more directly and more sincerely from the very depths of our soul than our unpremeditated and boundless aspirations toward the splendors of destiny. In these aspirations, much more than in deliberate, rational, coordinated ideas, is the real character of a man to be found. Our chimeras are the things which the most resemble us. Each one of us dreams of the unknown and the impossible in accordance with his nature. Towards the middle of this year 1831, the old woman who waited on Marius told him that his neighbors, the wretched Jondrette family, had been turned out of doors. Marius, who passed nearly the whole of his days out of the house, hardly knew that he had any neighbors. "Why are they turned out?" he asked. "Because they do not pay their rent. They owe for 2 quarters. "How much is it?" 20 francs, said the old woman. Marius had 30 francs saved up in a drawer. "Here," he said to the old woman, "take these 25 francs, pay for the poor people, and give them 5 francs, and do not tell them that it was I." Chapter 6. The Substitute. It chanced that the regiment to which Lieutenant Théodule belonged came to perform garrison duty in Paris. This inspired Aunt Gillenormand with a second idea. She had, on the first occasion, hit upon the plan of having Marius spied upon by Théodule. Now she plotted to have Théodule take Marius' place. At all events, and in case the grandfather should feel the vague need of a young face in the house, these rays of dawn are sometimes sweet to ruin, it was expedient to find another Marius. Take it as a simple erratum, she thought, such as one sees in books. For Marius, read Theodore. A grandnephew is almost the same as a grandson. In default of a lawyer, one takes a lancer. One morning, when Monsieur Gillenormand was about to read something in the Quotidienne, his daughter entered and said to him in her sweetest voice, for the question concerned her favorite, "Father, Theodule is coming to present his respects to you this morning." "Who's Theodule?" "Your grandnephew." "Ah," said the grandfather. Then he went back to his reading, thought no more of his grandnephew, who was merely some Theodule or other, and soon flew into a rage, which almost always happened when he read. The sheet, which he held, although royalist of course, announced for the following day, without any softening phrases, one of these little events which were of daily occurrence at that date in Paris, that the students of the schools of law and medicine were to assemble on the Place du Panthéon at midday to deliberate. The discussion concerned one of the questions of the moment, the artillery of the National Guard, and a conflict between the Minister of War and the citizens' militia. On the subject of the cannon parked in the courtyard of the Louvre, the students were to deliberate over this. It did not take much more than this to swell Monsieur Gillenormand's rage. He thought of Marius, who was a student, and who would probably go with the rest to deliberate at midday on the Place du Panthéon. As he was indulging in this painful dream, Lieutenant Théodule entered clad in plain clothes, as a bourgeois, which was clever of him, and was discreetly introduced by Mademoiselle Gillenormand. The lancer had reasoned as follows. "The old druid has not sunk all his money in a life pension. It is well to disguise oneself as a civilian from time to time." Mademoiselle Gillenormand said aloud to her father, "Theodore, your grandnephew," and in a low voice to the lieutenant, "approve of everything." And she withdrew. The lieutenant, who was but little accustomed to such venerable encounters, stammered with some timidity, a good day, uncle," and made a salute composed of the involuntary and mechanical outline of the military salute, finished off as a bourgeois salute. "Ah, so it's you. That's well. Sit down," said the old gentleman. That said, he totally forgot the lancer. Théodule seated himself, and Monsieur Gillenormand rose. Monsieur Gillenormand began to pace back and forth, his hands in his pockets, talking aloud and twitching with his irritated old fingers at the 2 watches which he wore in his 2 fobs. "That pack of brats! They convene on the Place du Panthéon. My life! Urchins who were with their nurses but yesterday, if one were to squeeze their noses, milk would burst out, and they'd deliberate tomorrow at midday. What are we coming to? What are we coming to? It is clear that we're making for the abyss. That is what descamisados have brought us to deliberate on the citizen artillery, to go and jabber in the open air over the jibes of the National Guard, and with whom are they to meet there? Just see whether Jacobinism leads. I will bet anything you like, 1,000,000 against a counter, that there will be no one there but returned convicts and released galley slaves, and the Republicans and the galley slaves. They form but one nose and one handkerchief. Carnot used to say, 'Where would you have me go, traitor?' Foch replied, 'Wherever you please, imbecile.' That's what the Republicans like." "That is true," said Théodule. Monsieur Gillenormand half turned his head, saw Théodule, and went on. "When one reflects that scoundrel was so vile as to turn Carbonaro, Why did you leave my house to go and become a Republican? In the first place, the people want none of your republic. They have common sense. They know well that there always have been kings and that there always will be. They know well that the people are only the people, after all. They make sport of it, of your republic. Do you understand, idiot? Is it not a horrible caprice? To fall in love with Père Duchesne, to make sheep's eyes at the guillotine, to sing romances and play on the guitar under the balcony of 93? It's enough to make one spit on all these young fellows. Such fools are they. They are all alike. Not one escapes. It suffices for them to breathe the air which blows through the streets to lose their senses. The 19th century is poison. The first scamp that happens along let his beard grow like a goat's. Thinks himself a real scoundrel and abandons his old relatives. He's a Republican, he's a romantic. What does that mean, romantic? Do me the favor to tell me what it is. All possible follies. A year ago, they ran to Hernani. Now, just to ask you, Hernani antithesis, abominations, which are not even written in French. And then they have cannons in the courtyard of the Louvre. Well, such are the rascalities of the age.
You are right, uncle, said Théodule. Monsieur Gillenormand resumed.
Cannons in the courtyard of the museum. Now, for what purpose? Do you want to fire grape shot at the Apollo Belvedere? What are those cartridges to do with the Venus de Medici? Oh, the young men of the present day are they're all blackguards. What a pretty creature is their Benjamin Constant. And those who are not rascals are simpletons, yes? They do all they can to make themselves ugly. They're badly dressed. They are afraid of women. In the presence of petticoats, they have a mendicant air which sets the girls into fits of laughter. On my word of honor. One would say the poor creatures are ashamed of love. They are deformed. And they complete themselves by being stupid. They repeat the puns of Tiercelin and Potier. They have sack coats, stablemen's waistcoats, shirts of coarse linen, trousers of coarse cloth, boots of coarse leather, and their rigmarole resembles their plumage. One might make use of their jargon to put new soles on their old shoes. And all this awkward batch of brats has political opinions, if you please. Political opinions should be strictly forbidden. They fabricate systems. They recast society. They demolish the monarchy. They fling all laws to the earth. They put the attic in the cellar's place and my porter in the place of the king. They turn Europe topsy-turvy. They reconstruct the world, and all their love affairs consist in staring slyly at the ankles of the laundresses as these women climb into their carts. Oh, Marius, you blackguard, to go and vociferate on a public place, to discuss, to debate, to take measures. They call that measures. Just God. Disorder humbles itself and becomes silly. I have seen chaos. Now I see a mess. Students deliberating on the National Guard. Such a thing could not be seen among the Ojibways nor the Cappadocians. Savages who go naked with their noodles dressed like a shuttlecock, with a club in their paws, are less of brutes than those bachelors of arts, four-penny monkeys. And they set up for judges. Those creatures deliberate and rationate. The end of the world has come. This is plainly the end of this miserable terraqueous globe. The final hiccup was required, and France has omitted it. Deliberate, my rascals. Such things will happen so long as they go and read the newspapers under the arcades of the Odeon. That cost them a sou, and their good sense, and their intelligence, and their heart, and their soul, and their wits. They emerge thence and decamp from their families. All newspapers are pests, all, even the Drapeau Blanc. At bottom, Martinville was a Jacobin. Just heaven, you may boast of having driven your grandfather to despair. That you may.
That is evident, said Théodule.
and profiting by the fact that Monsieur Gillenormand was taking breath, the lancer added in a magisterial manner, "There should be no other newspaper than the Moniteur, and no other book than the Annuaire Militaire." Monsieur Gillenormand continued, "It is like their Sieyès, a regicide ending in a senator, for that is the way they always end. They give themselves a scar with the address of thou as citizens, in order to get themselves called eventually Monsieur le Comte. Monsieur le Comte as big as my arm, assassins of September. The philosopher Sieyès, I will do myself the justice to say that I have never had any better opinion of the philosophies of all those philosophers than of the spectacles of the grimacer of Tivoli. Yeah, one day I saw the senators cross the Quai Malplaquet in mantles of violet velvet sewn with bees, with hats à la Henri IV. They were hideous. One would have pronounced them monkeys from the tiger's court. Citizens, I declare to you that your progress is madness, that your humanity is a dream, that your revolution is a crime, that your republic is a monster, that your young and virgin France comes from the brothel. And I maintain it against all, whoever you may be, whether journalists, economists, legists, or even were you better judges of liberty, of equality, and fraternity than the knife of the guillotine. And that I announce to you, my fine fellows."
"Parbleu!" cried the lieutenant. "That is wonderfully true."
Monsieur Gillenormand paused in a gesture which he had begun, wheeled round, stared Lancer Théodule intently in the eyes, and said to him, "You are a fool." End of chapters 5 and 6.
Book 6, The Conjunction of Two Stars. Chapter 1, The Sobriquet, Mode of Formation of Family Names. Marius was, at this epoch, a handsome young man, of medium stature, with thick and intensely black hair, a lofty and intelligent brow, well-opened and passionate nostrils, an air of calmness and sincerity, and with something indescribably proud, thoughtful, and innocent over his whole countenance. His profile, all of whose lines were rounded, without thereby losing their firmness, had a certain Germanic sweetness, which has made its way into the French physiognomy by way of Alsace and Lorraine, and that complete absence of angles which rendered the Sicambres so easily recognizable among the Romans, and which distinguishes the Leonine from the Aquiline race. He was at that period of life when the mind of men who think is composed in nearly equal parts of depth and ingenuousness. A grave situation being given, he had all that is required to be stupid. One more turn of the key and he might be sublime. His manners were reserved, cold, polished, not very genial. As his mouth was charming, his lips the reddest, and his teeth the whitest in the world, his smile corrected the severity of his face as a whole. At certain moments that pure brow and that voluptuous smile presented a singular contrast. His eyes were small, but his glance was large. At the period of his most abject misery, he had observed that young girls turned round when he passed by, and he fled or hid, with death in his soul. He thought that they were staring at him because of his old clothes, and that they were laughing at him. The fact is that they stared at him because of his grace, and that they dreamed of him. This mute misunderstanding between him and the pretty passers-by had made him shy. He chose none of them for the excellent reason that he fled from all of them. He lived thus indefinitely, stupidly, as Courfeyrac said. Courfeyrac also said to him, "Do not aspire to be venerable." They called each other thou. It is the tendency of youthful friendships to slip into this mode of address. Let me give you a piece of advice, my dear fellow. Don't read so many books, and look a little more at the lasses. The jades have some good points about them, O Marius. By dint of fleeing and blushing, you will become brutalized. On other occasions, Courfeyrac encountered him and said, "Good morning, Monsieur l'Abbé." When Courfeyrac had addressed to him some remark of this nature, Marius avoided women, both young and old, more than ever, for a week to come, and he avoided Courfeyrac to boot. Nevertheless, there existed in all the immensity of creation 2 women whom Marius did not flee, and to whom he paid no attention whatever. In truth, he would have been very much amazed if he had been informed that they were women. One was the bearded old woman who swept out his chamber and caused Courfeyrac to say, "Seeing that his servant woman wears his beard, Marius does not wear his own beard." The other was a sort of little girl whom he saw very often, and whom he never looked at. For more than a year, Marius had noticed in one of the walks of the Luxembourg, the one which skirts the parapet of the Pépinière, a man and a very young girl, who were almost always seated side by side on the same bench at the most solitary end of the alley, on the Rue de l'Ouest side. Every time that chance which meddles with the strolls of persons whose gaze is turned inwards led Marius to that walk, and it was nearly every day, he found this couple there. The man appeared to be about 60 years of age. He seemed sad and serious. His whole person presented the robust and weary aspect peculiar to military men who have retired from the service. If he had worn a decoration, Marius would have said he is an ex-officer. He had a kindly but unapproachable air, and he never let his glance linger on the eyes of anyone. He wore blue trousers, a blue frock coat, and a broad-brimmed hat, which always appeared to be new, a black cravat, a Quaker shirt, that is to say, it was dazzlingly white, but of coarse linen. A grisette who passed near him one day said, "Here's a very tidy widower." His hair was very white. The first time that the young girl who accompanied him came and seated herself on the bench which they seemed to have adopted, she was a sort of child 13 or 14 years of age, so thin as to be almost homely, awkward, insignificant, and with a possible promise of handsome eyes. Only they were always raised with a sort of displeasing assurance. Her dress was both aged and childish, like the dress of the scholars in a convent. It consisted of a badly cut gown of black merino. They had the air of being father and daughter. Marius scanned this old man, who was not yet aged, and this little girl, who was not yet a person, for a few days, and thereafter paid no attention to them. They, on their side, did not appear even to see him. They conversed together with a peaceful and indifferent air. The girl chattered incessantly and merrily. The old man talked but little, and at times he fixed on her eyes overflowing with an ineffable paternity. Marius had acquired the mechanical habit of strolling in that walk. He invariably found them there. This is the way things went. Marius liked to arrive by the end of the alley which was furthest from their bench. He walked the whole length of the alley, passed in front of them, then returned to the extremity whence he had come, and began again. This he did 5 or 6 times in the course of his promenade, and the promenade was taken 5 or 6 times a week, without its having occurred to him or to these people to exchange a greeting. That personage and that young girl, although they appeared, and perhaps because they appeared, to shun all glances, had naturally caused some attention on the part of the 5 or 6 students who strolled along the Pépinière from time to time, the studious after their lectures, the others after their game of billiards. Courfeyrac, who was among the last, had observed them several times, but finding the girl homely, he had speedily and carefully kept out of the way. He had fled, discharging at them a sobriquet, like a Parthian dart. Impressed solely with the child's gown and the old man's hair, he had dubbed the daughter Mademoiselle Lanoire and the father Monsieur Leblanc, so that, as no one knew them under any other title, this nickname became a law in the default of any other name. The students said, "Ah, Monsieur Leblanc is on his bench," and Marius, like the rest, had found it convenient to call this unknown gentleman Monsieur Leblanc. We shall follow their example, and we shall say Monsieur Leblanc, in order to facilitate this tale. So Marius saw them nearly every day, at the same hour, during the first year. He found the man to his taste, but the girl insipid. Chapter 2. Lux facta est. During the second year, precisely at the point in this history which the reader has now reached, it chanced that this habit of the Luxembourg was interrupted, without Marius himself being quite aware why, and nearly 6 months elapsed during which he did not set foot in the alley. One day, at last, he returned thither once more. It was a serene summer morning, and Marius was in joyous mood, as one is when the weather is fine. It seemed to him that he had in his heart all the songs of the birds that he was listening to, and all the bits of blue sky of which he caught glimpses through the leaves of the trees. He went straight to his alley, and when he reached the end of it, he perceived, still on the same bench, that well-known couple. Only, when he approached, it certainly was the same man, but it seemed to him that it was no longer the same girl. The person whom he now beheld was a tall and beautiful creature, possessed of all the most charming lines of a woman, at the precise moment when they are still combined with all the most ingenuous graces of the child, a pure and fugitive moment, which can be expressed only by these 2 words, 15 years. She had wonderful brown hair, shaded with threads of gold, a brow that seemed made of marble, cheeks that seemed made of rose-leaf, a pale flush, an agitated whiteness, an exquisite mouth, whence smiles darted like sunbeams, and words like music, a head such as Raphael would have given to Mary, set upon a neck that Jean Goujon would have attributed to a Venus. And in order that nothing might be lacking to this bewitching face, her nose was not handsome, it was pretty. Neither straight nor curved, neither Italian nor Greek, it was the Parisian nose, that is to say, spiritual, delicate, irregular, pure, which drives painters to despair and charms poets. When Marius passed near her, he could not see her eyes, which were constantly lowered. He saw only her long chestnut lashes, permeated with shadow and modesty. This did not prevent the beautiful child from smiling as she listened to what the white-haired old man was saying to her, and nothing could be more fascinating than that fresh smile, combined with those drooping eyes. For a moment, Marius thought that she was another daughter of the same man, a sister of the former, no doubt. But when the invariable habit of his stroll brought him for the second time near the bench, and he had examined her attentively, he recognized her as the same. In 6 months, the little girl had become a young maiden, that was all. Nothing is more frequent than this phenomenon. There is a moment when girls blossom out in the twinkling of an eye and become roses all at once. One left them children but yesterday. Today, one finds them disquieting to the feelings. The child had not only grown, she had become idealized. As 3 days in April sufficed to cover certain trees with flowers, 6 months had sufficed to clothe her with beauty. Her April had arrived. One sometimes sees people who, poor and mean, seem to wake up, pass suddenly from indigence to luxury, indulge in expenditures of all sorts, and become dazzling, prodigal, magnificent, all of a sudden. That is the result of having pocketed an income. A note fell due yesterday. The young girl had received her quarterly income. And then she was no longer the schoolgirl with her felt hat, her merino gown, her scholar's shoes and red hands. Taste had come to her with beauty. She was a well-dressed person, clad with a sort of rich and simple elegance, and without affectation. She wore a dress of black damask, a cape of the same material, and a bonnet of white crape. Her white gloves displayed the delicacy of the hand which toyed with the carved Chinese ivory handle of a parasol, and her silken shoe outlined the smallness of her foot. When one passed near her, her whole toilette exhaled a youthful and penetrating perfume. As for the man, he was the same as usual. The second time that Marius approached her, the young girl raised her eyelids. Her eyes were of a deep celestial blue, but in that veiled azure there was as yet nothing but the glance of a child. She looked at Marius indifferently, as she would have stared at the brat running beneath the sycamores, or the marble vase which cast a shadow on the bench. And Marius, on his side, continued his promenade, and thought about something else. He passed near the bench where the young girl sat 5 or 6 times, but without even turning his eyes in her direction. On the following days he returned, as was his wont, to the Luxembourg. As usual, he found there the father and daughter, but he paid no further attention to them. He thought no more about the girl, now that she was beautiful, than he had when she was homely. He passed very near the bench where she sat, because such was his habit. End of Book 6, Chapters 1 and 2. Book 6, The Conjunction of Two Stars. Chapter 3, Effect of the Spring. One day the air was warm. The Luxembourg was inundated with light and shade. The sky was as pure as though the angels had washed it that morning. The sparrows were giving vent to little twitters in the depths of the chestnut trees. Marius had thrown open his whole soul to nature. He was not thinking of anything. He simply lived and breathed. He passed near the bench. The young girl raised her eyes to him. The two glances met. What was there in the young girl's glance on this occasion? Marius could not have told. There was nothing, and there was everything. It was a strange flash. She dropped her eyes, and he pursued his way. What he had just seen was no longer the ingenuous and simple eye of a child. It was a mysterious gulf which had half opened, then abruptly closed again. There comes a day when the young girl glances in this manner. Woe to him who chances to be there. That first gaze of a soul which does not as yet know itself is like the dawn in the sky. It is the awakening of something radiant and strange. Nothing can give any idea of the dangerous charm of that unexpected gleam which flashes suddenly and vaguely forth from adorable shadows, and which is composed of all the innocence of the present and of all the passion of the future. It is a sort of undecided tenderness which reveals itself by chance and which waits. It is a snare which the innocent maiden sets, unknown to herself, and in which she captures hearts without either wishing or knowing it. It is a virgin looking like a woman. It is rare that a profound reverie does not spring from that glance where it falls. All purities and all candors meet in that celestial and fatal gleam, which, more than all the best planned tender glances of coquettes, possesses the magic power of causing the sudden blossoming in the depths of the soul of that sombre flower, impregnated with perfume and with poison, which is called love. That evening, on his return to his garret, Marius cast his eyes over his garments and perceived for the first time that he had been so slovenly, indecorous, and inconceivably stupid as to go for his walk in the Luxembourg with his everyday clothes, that is to say, with a hat battered near the band, coarse carter's boots, black trousers which showed white at the knees, and a black coat which was pale at the elbows. Chapter 4. Beginning of a great malady. On the following day, at the accustomed hour, Marius drew from his wardrobe his new coat, his new trousers, his new hat, and his new boots. He clothed himself in this complete panoply, put on his gloves, a tremendous luxury, and set off for the Luxembourg. On the way thither, he encountered Courfeyrac, and pretended not to see him. Courfeyrac, on his return home, said to his friends, "I have just met Marius's new hat and new coat, with Marius inside them. He was going to pass an examination, no doubt. He looked utterly stupid." On arriving at the Luxembourg, Marius made a tour of the fountain basin, and stared at the swans. Then he remained for a long time in contemplation before a statue whose head was perfectly black with mould, and one of whose hips was missing. Near the basin there was a bourgeois 40 years of age, with a prominent stomach, who was holding by the hand a little urchin of 5, and saying to him, "Shun excess, my son. Keep at an equal distance from despotism and from anarchy." Marius listened to this bourgeois. Then he made the circuit of the basin once more. At last he directed his course towards his alley, slowly and as if with regret. One would have said that he was both forced to go there and withheld from doing so. He did not perceive it himself, and thought that he was doing as he always did. On turning into the walk, he saw Monsieur Leblanc and the young girl at the other end, on their bench. He buttoned his coat up to the very top, pulled it down on his body so that there might be no wrinkles, examined with a certain complaisance the lustrous gleams of his trousers, and marched on the bench. This march savoured of an attack, and certainly of a desire for conquest, so I say that he marched on the bench, as I should say Hannibal marched on Rome. However, all his movements were purely mechanical, and he had interrupted none of the habitual preoccupations of his mind and labours. At that moment he was thinking that the Manuel du Baccalauréat was a stupid book, and that it must have been drawn up by rare idiots to allow of 3 tragedies of Racine and only 1 comedy of Molière being analysed therein as masterpieces of the human mind. There was a piercing whistling going on in his ears. As he approached the bench, he held fast to the folds in his coat and fixed his eyes on the young girl. It seemed to him that she filled the entire extremity of the alley with a vague blue light. In proportion as he drew near, his pace slackened more and more. On arriving at some little distance from the bench, and long before he had reached the end of the walk, he halted, and could not explain to himself why he retraced his steps. He did not even say to himself that he would not go as far as the end. It was only with difficulty that the young girl could have perceived him in the distance and noted his fine appearance in his new clothes. Nevertheless, he held himself very erect in case anyone should be looking at him from behind. He attained the opposite end, then came back, and this time he approached a little nearer to the bench. He even got to within 3 intervals of trees, but there he felt an indescribable impossibility of proceeding further, and he hesitated. He thought he saw the young girl's face bending towards him. But he exerted a manly and violent effort, subdued his hesitation, and walked straight ahead. A few seconds later he rushed in front of the bench, erect and firm, reddening to the very ears, without daring to cast a glance either to the right or to the left, with his hand thrust into his coat like a statesman. At the moment when he passed under the cannon of the place, he felt his heart beat wildly. As on the preceding day, she wore her damask gown and her crape bonnet. He heard an ineffable voice, which must have been her voice. She was talking tranquilly. She was very pretty. He felt it, although he made no attempt to see her. She could not, however, he thought, help feeling esteem and consideration for me if she only knew that I am the veritable author of the dissertation on Marcos Obregon de la Ronde, which Monsieur François de Neufchâteau put, as though it were his own, at the head of his edition of Gil Blas. He went beyond the bench as far as the extremity of the walk, which was very near, then turned on his heel and passed once more in front of the lovely girl. This time he was very pale. Moreover, all his emotions were disagreeable. As he went further from the bench and the young girl, and while his back was turned to her, he fancied that she was gazing after him, and that made him stumble. He did not attempt to approach the bench again. He halted near the middle of the walk, and there, a thing which he never did, he sat down, and reflecting in the most profoundly indistinct depths of his spirit, that after all, it was hard that persons whose white bonnet and black gown he admired should be absolutely insensible to his splendid trousers and his new coat. At the expiration of a quarter of an hour he rose, as though he were on the point of again beginning his march towards that bench which was surrounded by an aureole. But he remained standing there, motionless. For the first time in 15 months, he said to himself that that gentleman who sat there every day with his daughter had on his side noticed him, and probably considered his assiduity singular. For the first time also, he was conscious of some irreverence in designating that stranger even in his secret thoughts by the sobriquet of Monsieur Leblanc. He stood thus for several minutes, with drooping head, tracing figures in the sand with the cane which he held in his hand. Then he turned abruptly in the direction opposite to the bench, to Monsieur Leblanc and his daughter, and went home. That day he forgot to dine. At 8 o'clock in the evening he perceived this fact, and as it was too late to go down to the Rue Saint-Jacques, he said never mind, and ate a bit of bread. He did not go to bed until he had brushed his coat and folded it up with great care. End of Book 6, Chapters 3 and 4. Book 6, The Conjunction of Two Stars. Chapter 5, Divers claps of thunder fall on Mame Bougon. On the following day, Mame Bougon, as Courfeyrac styled the old portress principal tenant, housekeeper of the Gorbeau hovel, Mame Bougon, whose name was in reality Madame Bourgon, as we have found out, but this iconoclast Courfeyrac respected nothing, Mame Bougon observed with stupefaction that Monsieur Marius was going out again in his new coat. He went to the Luxembourg again, but he did not proceed further than his bench midway of the alley. He seated himself there, as on the preceding day, surveying from a distance and clearly making out the white bonnet, the black dress, and above all, that blue light. He did not stir from it, and only went home when the gates of the Luxembourg closed. He did not see Monsieur Leblanc and his daughter retire. He concluded that they had quitted the garden by the gate on the Rue de l'Ouest. Later on, several weeks afterwards, when he came to think it over, he could never recall where he had dined that evening. On the following day, which was the 3rd, Mame Bougon was thunderstruck. Marius went out in his new coat. 3 days in succession, she exclaimed. She tried to follow him, but Marius walked briskly and with immense strides. It was a hippopotamus undertaking the pursuit of a chamois. She lost sight of him in 2 minutes, and returned breathless, 3/4 choked with asthma, and furious. "If there is any sense," she growled, "in putting on one's best clothes every day and making people run like this." Marius betook himself to the Luxembourg. The young girl was there with Monsieur Leblanc. Marius approached as near as he could, pretending to be busy reading a book, but he halted afar off, then returned and seated himself on his bench, where he spent 4 hours in watching the house sparrows who were skipping about the walk, and who produced on him the impression that they were making sport of him. A fortnight passed thus. Marius went to the Luxembourg no longer for the sake of strolling there, but to seat himself always in the same spot, and that without knowing why. Once arrived there, he did not stir. He put on his new coat every morning for the purpose of not showing himself, and he began all over again on the morrow. She was decidedly a marvelous beauty. The only remark approaching a criticism that could be made was that the contradiction between her gaze, which was melancholy, and her smile, which was merry, gave a rather wild effect to her face, which sometimes caused this sweet countenance to become strange, without ceasing to be charming. Chapter 6, Taken Prisoner. On one of the last days of the 2nd week, Marius was seated on his bench as usual, holding in his hand an open book, of which he had not turned a page for the last 2 hours. All at once he started. An event was taking place at the other extremity of the walk. Leblanc and his daughter had just left their seat, and the daughter had taken her father's arm, and both were advancing slowly towards the middle of the alley where Marius was. Marius closed his book, then opened it again, then forced himself to read. He trembled. The aureole was coming straight towards him. "Ah, good heavens," thought he, "I shall not have time to strike an attitude." Still the white-haired man and the girl advanced. It seemed to him that this lasted for a century, and that it was but a second. "What are they coming in this direction for?" he asked himself. "What, she will pass here? Her feet will tread this sand, this walk, 2 paces from me?" He was utterly upset. He would have liked to be very handsome. He would have liked to own the cross. He heard the soft and measured sound of their approaching footsteps. He imagined that Monsieur Leblanc was darting angry glances at him. "Is that gentleman going to address me?" he thought to himself. He dropped his head. When he raised it again, they were very near him. The young girl passed, and as she passed, she glanced at him. She gazed steadily at him with a pensive sweetness which thrilled Marius from head to foot. It seemed to him that she was reproaching him for having allowed so long a time to elapse without coming as far as her, and that she was saying to him, "I am coming myself." Marius was dazzled by those eyes fraught with rays and abysses. He felt his brain on fire. She had come to him. What joy! And then how she had looked at him! She appeared to him more beautiful than he had ever seen her yet. Beautiful with a beauty which was wholly feminine and angelic, with a complete beauty which would have made Petrarch sing and Dante kneel. It seemed to him that he was floating free in the azure heavens. At the same time he was horribly vexed, because there was dust on his boots. He thought he felt sure that she had looked at his boots too. He followed her with his eyes until she disappeared. Then he started up and walked about the Luxembourg garden like a madman. It is possible that at times he laughed to himself and talked aloud. He was so dreamy when he came near the children's nurses that each one of them thought him in love with her. He quitted the Luxembourg, hoping to find her again in the street. He encountered Courfeyrac under the arcades of the Odeon and said to him, "Come and dine with me." They went off to Rousseau's and spent 6 francs. Marius ate like an ogre. He gave the waiter 6 sous. At dessert, he said to Courfeyrac, "Have you read the paper? What a fine discourse Audry de Puyraveau delivered." He was desperately in love. After dinner, he said to Courfeyrac, "I will treat you to the play." They went to the Porte Saint-Martin to see Frédéric in l'Auberge des Adrets. Marius was enormously amused. At the same time, he had a redoubled attack of shyness. On emerging from the theatre, he refused to look at the garter of a modiste who was stepping across a gutter, and Courfeyrac, who said, "I should like to put that woman in my collection," almost horrified him. Courfeyrac invited him to breakfast at the Café Voltaire on the following morning. Marius went thither and ate even more than on the preceding evening. He was very thoughtful and very merry. One would have said that he was taking advantage of every occasion to laugh uproariously. He tenderly embraced some man or other from the provinces who was presented to him. A circle of students formed round the table, and they spoke of the nonsense paid for by the state which was uttered from the rostrum in the Sorbonne. Then the conversation fell upon the faults and omissions in Guicherat's dictionaries and grammars. Marius interrupted the discussion to exclaim, "But it is very agreeable all the same to have the cross." "That's queer," whispered Courfeyrac to Jean Prouvaire. "No," responded Prouvaire, "that's serious." It was serious. In fact, Marius had reached that first violent and charming hour with which grand passions begin. A glance had wrought all this. When the mine is charged, when the conflagration is ready, nothing is more simple. A glance is a spark. It was all over with him. Marius loved a woman. His fate was entering the unknown. The glance of women resembles certain combinations of wheels which are tranquil in appearance, yet formidable. You pass close to them every day, peaceably and with impunity, and without a suspicion of anything. A moment arrives when you forget that the thing is there. You go and come, dream, speak, laugh. All at once you feel yourself clutched. All is over. The wheels hold you fast. The glance has ensnared you. It has caught you, no matter where or how, by some portion of your thought which was fluttering loose, by some distraction which had attacked you. You are lost. The whole of you passes into it. A chain of mysterious forces takes possession of you. You struggle in vain. No more human succor is possible. You go on falling from gearing to gearing, from agony to agony, from torture to torture, you, your mind, your fortune, your future, your soul. And according to whether you are in the power of a wicked creature or of a noble heart, you will not escape from this terrifying machine otherwise than disfigured with shame, or transfigured by passion. End of Book 6, Chapters 5 and 6. Book 6, The Conjunction of Two Stars. Chapter 7, Adventures of the Letter U, delivered over to conjectures. Isolation, detachment from everything, pride, independence, the taste of nature, the absence of daily and material activity, the life within himself, the secret conflicts of chastity, a benevolent ecstasy towards all creation, had prepared Marius for this possession which is called passion. His worship of his father had gradually become a religion, and like all religions, it had retreated to the depths of his soul. Something was required in the foreground. Love came. A full month elapsed, during which Marius went every day to the Luxembourg. When the hour arrived, nothing could hold him back. "He is on duty," said Courfeyrac. Marius lived in a state of delight. It is certain that the young girl did look at him. He had finally grown bold and approached the bench. Still, he did not pass in front of it any more, in obedience to the instinct of timidity and to the instinct of prudence common to lovers. He considered it better not to attract the attention of the father. He combined his stations behind the trees and the pedestals of the statues with a profound diplomacy, so that he might be seen as much as possible by the young girl and as little as possible by the old gentleman. Sometimes he remained motionless by the half-hour together in the shade of a Leonidas or a Spartacus, holding in his hand a book, above which his eyes, gently raised, sought the beautiful girl, and she, on her side, turned her charming profile towards him with a vague smile. While conversing in the most natural and tranquil manner in the world with the white-haired man, she bent upon Marius all the reveries of a virginal and passionate eye. Ancient and time-honored maneuver, which Eve understood from the very first day of the world, and which every woman understands from the very first day of her life. Her mouth replied to one, and her glance replied to another. It must be supposed that M. Leblanc finally noticed something, for often when Marius arrived, he rose and began to walk about. He had abandoned their accustomed place and had adopted the bench by the Gladiator near the other end of the walk, as though with the object of seeing whether Marius would pursue them thither. Marius did not understand, and committed this error. The father began to grow inexact, and no longer brought his daughter every day. Sometimes he came alone. Then Marius did not stay. Another blunder. Marius paid no heed to these symptoms. From the phase of timidity he had passed, by a natural and fatal progress, to the phase of blindness. His love increased. He dreamed of it every night. And then an unexpected bliss had happened to him, oil on the fire, a redoubling of the shadows over his eyes. One evening, at dusk, he had found on the bench which M. Leblanc and his daughter had just quitted, a handkerchief, a very simple handkerchief, without embroidery, but white and fine, and which seemed to him to exhale ineffable perfume. He seized it with rapture. This handkerchief was marked with the letters U.F. Marius knew nothing about this beautiful child, neither her family name, her Christian name, nor her abode. These two letters were the first thing of her that he had gained possession of, adorable initials, upon which he immediately began to construct his scaffolding. U was evidently the Christian name. Ursule, he thought, what a delicious name. He kissed the handkerchief, drank it in, placed it on his heart, on his flesh during the day, and at night laid it beneath his lips that he might fall asleep on it. "I feel that her whole soul lies within it," he exclaimed. This handkerchief belonged to the old gentleman, who had simply let it fall from his pocket. In the days which followed the finding of this treasure, he only displayed himself at the Luxembourg in the act of kissing the handkerchief and laying it on his heart. The beautiful child understood nothing of all this, and signified it to him by imperceptible signs. "Oh, modesty," said Marius. Chapter 8. The veterans themselves can be happy. Since we have pronounced the word modesty, and since we conceal nothing, we ought to say that once, nevertheless, in spite of his ecstasies, his Ursule caused him very serious grief. It was on one of the days when she persuaded Monsieur Leblanc to leave the bench and stroll along the walk. A brisk May breeze was blowing, which swayed the crests of the plantain trees. The father and daughter, arm in arm, had just passed Marius' bench. Marius had risen to his feet behind them, and was following them with his eyes, as was fitting in the desperate situation of his soul. All at once a gust of wind, more merry than the rest, and probably charged with performing the affairs of springtime, swept down from the nursery, flung itself on the alley, enveloped the young girl in a delicious shiver, worthy of Virgil's nymphs and the fawns of Theocritus, and lifted her dress, the robe more sacred than that of Isis, almost to the height of her garter. A leg of exquisite shape appeared. Marius saw it. He was exasperated and furious. The young girl had hastily thrust down her dress with a divinely troubled motion, but he was none the less angry for all that. He was alone in the alley, it is true, but there might have been someone there. And what if there had been someone there? Can anyone comprehend such a thing? What she had just done is horrible. Alas, the poor child had done nothing. There had been but one culprit, the wind. But Marius, in whom quivered the Bartolo who exists in cherubin, was determined to be vexed, and was jealous of his own shadow. It is thus, in fact, that the harsh and capricious jealousy of the flesh awakens in the human heart, and takes possession of it, even without any right. Moreover, setting aside even that jealousy, the sight of that charming leg had contained nothing agreeable for him. The white stocking of the first woman he chanced to meet would have afforded him more pleasure. When his Ursule, after having reached the end of the walk, retraced her steps with Monsieur Leblanc, and passed in front of the bench on which Marius had seated himself once more, Marius darted a sullen and ferocious glance at her. The young girl gave way to that slight straightening up with a backward movement, accompanied by a raising of the eyelids, which signifies, "Well, what is the matter?" This was their first quarrel. Marius had hardly made this scene at her with his eyes, when some one crossed the walk. It was a veteran, very much bent, extremely wrinkled, and pale, in a uniform of the Louis XV pattern, bearing on his breast the little oval plaque of red cloth, with the crossed swords, the soldier's cross of Saint Louis, and adorned, in addition, with a coat sleeve which had no arm in it, with a silver chin and a wooden leg. Marius thought he perceived that this man had an extremely well-satisfied air. It even struck him that the aged cynic, as he hobbled along past him, addressed to him a very fraternal and very merry wink, as though some chance had created an understanding between them, and as though they had shared some piece of good luck together. What did that relic of Mars mean by being so contented? What had passed between that wooden leg and the other? Marius reached a paroxysm of jealousy. Perhaps he was there, he said to himself, perhaps he saw, and he felt a desire to exterminate the veteran. With the aid of time, all points grow dull. Marius's wrath against Ursule, just and legitimate as it was, passed off. He finally pardoned her, but this cost him a great effort. He sulked for 3 days. Nevertheless, in spite of all this, and because of all this, his passion augmented and grew to madness. Chapter 9. Eclipse. The reader has just seen how Marius discovered, or thought that he discovered, that she was named Ursule. Appetite grows with loving. To know that her name was Ursule was a great deal. It was very little. In 3 or 4 weeks, Marius had devoured this bliss. He wanted another. He wanted to know where she lived. He had committed his first blunder by falling into the ambush of the bench by the gladiator. He had committed a second by not remaining at the Luxembourg when Monsieur Leblanc came thither alone. He now committed a third and an immense one. He followed Ursule. She lived in the Rue de l'Ouest, in the most unfrequented spot, in a new 3-story house of modest appearance. From that moment forth, Marius added to his happiness of seeing her at the Luxembourg the happiness of following her home. His hunger was increasing. He knew her first name at least, a charming name, a genuine woman's name. He knew where she lived. He wanted to know who she was. One evening, after he had followed them to their dwelling and had seen them disappear through the carriage gate, he entered in their train and said boldly to the porter, "Is that the gentleman who lives on the first floor who has just come in?" "No," replied the porter, "he is the gentleman on the 3rd floor." Another step gained. This success emboldened Marius. "On the front?" he asked. "Parbleu," said the porter, "the house is only built on the street." "And what is that gentleman's business?" began Marius again. "He is a gentleman of property, sir, a very kind man, who does good to the unfortunate, though not rich himself." "What is his name?" resumed Marius. The porter raised his head and said, "Are you a police spy, sir?" Marius went off quite abashed, but delighted. He was getting on. "Good," thought he. "I know that her name is Ursule, that she is the daughter of a gentleman who lives on his income, and that she lives there, on the 3rd floor in the Rue de l'Ouest." On the following day, M. Leblanc and his daughter made only a very brief stay in the Luxembourg. They went away while it was still broad daylight. Marius followed them to the Rue de l'Ouest, as he had taken up the habit of doing. On arriving at the carriage entrance, M. Leblanc made his daughter pass in first, then paused before crossing the threshold, and stared intently at Marius. On the next day they did not come to the Luxembourg. Marius waited for them all day in vain. At nightfall he went to the Rue de l'Ouest, and saw a light in the windows of the 3rd story. He walked about beneath the windows until the light was extinguished. The next day, no one at the Luxembourg. Marius waited all day, then went and did sentinel duty under their windows. This carried him on to 10 o'clock in the evening. His dinner took care of itself. Fever nourishes the sick man, and love the lover. He spent a week in this manner. M. Leblanc no longer appeared at the Luxembourg. Marius indulged in melancholy conjectures. He dared not watch the porte cochère during the day. He contented himself with going at night to gaze upon the red light of the windows. At times he saw shadows flit across them, and his heart began to beat. On the 8th day, when he arrived under the windows, there was no light in them. "Hello," he said, "the lamp is not lighted yet, but it is dark. Can they have gone out?" He waited until 10 o'clock, until midnight, until 1 in the morning. Not a light appeared in the windows of the 3rd story, and no one entered the house. He went away in a very gloomy frame of mind. On the morrow, for he only existed from morrow to morrow, there was, so to speak, no today for him. On the morrow, he found no one at the Luxembourg. He had expected this. At dusk, he went to the house. No light in the windows. The shades were drawn. The 3rd floor was totally dark. Marius rapped at the porte cochère, entered, and said to the porter, "The gentleman on the 3rd floor?" "Has moved away," replied the porter. Marius reeled and said feebly, "How long ago?" "Yesterday." "Where is he living now?" "I don't know anything about it." "So he has not left his new address?" "No." And the porter, raising his eyes, recognized Marius. "Come, so it's you," he said. "But you are decidedly a spy, then." End of Book 6, Chapters 7, 8, and 9.
Book 7, Patron Minette. Chapter 1, Minds and Minds. Human societies all have what is called, in theatrical parlance, a 3rd lower floor. The social soil is everywhere undermined, sometimes for good, sometimes for evil. These works are superposed one upon the other. There are superior minds and inferior minds. There is a top and a bottom in this obscure subsoil, which sometimes give way beneath civilization, and which our indifference and heedlessness trample underfoot. The encyclopedia in the last century was a mine that was almost open to the sky. The shades, those sombre hatches of primitive Christianity, only awaited an opportunity to bring about an explosion under the Caesars and to inundate the human race with light. For in the sacred shadows there lies latent light. Volcanoes are full of a shadow that is capable of flashing forth. Every form begins by being night. The catacombs in which the first Mass was said were not alone the cellar of Rome. They were the vaults of the world. Beneath the social construction, that complicated marvel of a structure, there are excavations of all sorts. There is the religious mind, the philosophical mind, the economic mind, the revolutionary mind, such and such a pickaxe with the idea, such a pick with ciphers, such another with wrath. People hail and answer each other from one catacomb to another. Utopias travel about underground in the pipes. There they branch out in every direction. They sometimes meet and fraternize there. Jean-Jacques lends his pick to Diogenes, who lends him his lantern. Sometimes they enter into combat there. Calvin seizes Socinus by the hair, but nothing arrests nor interrupts the tension of all these energies towards the goal and the vast simultaneous activity, which goes and comes, mounts, descends, and mounts again in these obscurities, and which immense unknown swarming slowly transforms the top and the bottom, and the inside and the outside. Societies hardly even suspects this digging which leaves its surface intact and changes its bowels. There are as many different subterranean stages as there are varying works, as there are extractions. What emerges from these deep excavations? The future. The deeper one goes, the more mysterious are the toilers. The work is good, up to a degree which the social philosophies are able to recognize. Beyond that degree, it is doubtful and mixed. Lower down, it becomes terrible. At a certain depth, the excavations are no longer penetrable by the spirit of civilization. The limit breathable by man has been passed. A beginning of monsters is possible. The descending scale is a strange one, and each one of the rungs of this ladder corresponds to a stage where philosophy can find foothold, and where one encounters one of these workmen, sometimes divine, sometimes misshapen. Below John Huss there is Luther. Below Luther there is Descartes. Below Descartes there is Voltaire. Below Voltaire there is Condorcet. Below Condorcet there is Robespierre. Below Robespierre there is Marat. Below Marat there is Babeuf. And so it goes on. Lower down, confusedly, at the limit which separates the indistinct from the invisible, one perceives other gloomy men, who perhaps do not exist as yet. The men of yesterday are spectres. Those of tomorrow are forms. The eye of the spirit distinguishes them but obscurely. The embryonic work of the future is one of the visions of philosophy. A world in limbo, and the state of fetus. What an unheard-of spectre! Saint-Simon, Owen, Fourier are there also, in lateral galleries. Surely, although a divine and invisible chain, unknown to themselves, binds together all these subterranean pioneers who almost always think themselves isolated, and who are not so, their works vary greatly, and the light of some contrasts with the blaze of others. The first are paradisiacal, the last are tragic. Nevertheless, whatever may be the contrast, all these toilers, from the highest to the most nocturnal, from the wisest to the most foolish, possess one likeness, and this is it, disinterestedness. Marat forgets himself like Jesus. They throw themselves on one side, they omit themselves, they think not of themselves. They have a glance, and that glance seeks the absolute. The first has the whole heavens in his eyes. The last, enigmatical though he may be, has still beneath his eyelids the pale beam of the infinite. Venerate the man, whoever he may be, who has this sign, the starry eye. The shadowy eye is the other sign. With it, evil commences. Reflect and tremble in the presence of anyone who has no glance at all. The social order has its black miners. There is a point where depth is tantamount to burial, and where light becomes extinct. Below all these mines, which we have just mentioned, below all these galleries, below this whole immense subterranean Venus system of progress and utopia, much further on in the earth, much lower than Marat, lower than Babeuf, lower, much lower, and without any connection with the upper levels, there lies the last mine, a formidable spot. This is what we have designated as le troisième dessous. It is the grave of shadows. It is the cellar of the blind, inferi. This communicates with the abyss. Chapter 2. The lowest depth. There, disinterestedness vanishes. The demon is vaguely outlined. Each one is for himself. The eye in the eyes holes, seeks, fumbles, and gnaws. The social Ugolino is in this gulf. The wild spectres who roam in this grave, almost beasts, almost phantoms, are not occupied with universal progress. They are ignorant both of the idea and of the word. They take no thought for anything but the satisfaction of their individual desires. They are almost unconscious, and there exists within them a sort of terrible obliteration. They have two mothers, both stepmothers, ignorance and misery. They have a guide, necessity, and for all forms of satisfaction, appetite. They are brutally voracious, and that is to say, ferocious, not after the fashion of the tyrant, but after the fashion of the tiger. From suffering these spectres pass to crime, fatal affiliation, desecration, logic of darkness. That which crawls in the social third lower level is no longer complaint stifled by the absolute. It is the protest of matter. Man there becomes a dragon. To be hungry, to be thirsty, that is the point of departure. To be Satan, that is the point reached. From that vault, Lacenaire emerges. We have just seen, in Book 4, one of the compartments of the upper mind, of the great political, revolutionary, and philosophical excavation. There, as we have just said, all is pure, noble, dignified, honest. There, assuredly, one might be misled, but error is worthy of veneration there. So thoroughly does it imply heroism. The work there effected, taken as a whole, has a name: progress. The moment has now come when we must take a look at utter depth, hideous depth. There exists beneath society, we insist upon this point, and there will exist, until that day when ignorance shall be dissipated, the great cavern of evil. This cavern is below all, and is the foe of all. It is hatred without exception. This cavern knows no philosophers, its daggers have never cut a pen, its blackness has no connection with the sublime blackness of the inkstand. Never have the fingers of night, which contract beneath the stifling ceiling, turned the leaves of a book, nor enfolded a newspaper. Babeuf is a speculator to Cartouche. Marat is an aristocrat to Schinderhannes. This cavern has for its object the destruction of everything. Of everything, including the upper superior minds which it execrates. It not only undermines, in its hideous swarming, the actual social order, it undermines philosophy, it undermines human thought, it undermines civilization, it undermines revolution, it undermines progress. Its name is simply theft, prostitution, murder, assassination. It is darkness and it desires chaos. Its vault is formed of ignorance. All the others, those above it, have but one object: to suppress it. It is to this point that philosophy and progress tend, with all their organs simultaneously, by their amelioration of the real as well as by their contemplation of the absolute. Destroy the cavern ignorance, and you destroy the lair crime. Let us condense, in a few words, a part of what we have just written. The only social peril is darkness. Humanity is identity. All men are made of the same clay. There is no difference, here below, at least in predestination. The same shadow in front, the same flesh in the present, the same ashes afterwards. But ignorance, mingled with the human paste, blackens it. This incurable blackness takes possession of the interior of a man and is there converted into evil. End of Book 7, Chapter 1 and 2. Recording by Cagliostro.
Book 7th, Patron Minette. Chapter 3, Babet, Gueulemer, Claquesous, and Montparnasse. A quartet of ruffians, Claquesous, Gueulemer, Babet, and Montparnasse, governed the third lower floor of Paris from 1830 to 1835. Gueulemer was a Hercules of no defined position. For his lair he had the sewer of the Arche Marion. He was 6 feet high, his pectoral muscles were of marble, his biceps of brass, his breath was that of a cavern, his torso that of a colossus, his head that of a bird. One thought one beheld the Farnese Hercules clad in duck trousers and a cotton velvet waistcoat. Gueulemer, built after this sculptural fashion, might have subdued monsters. he had found it more expeditious to be one. A low brow, large temples, less than 40 years of age, but with crow's feet, harsh short hair, cheeks like a brush, a beard like that of a wild boar, the reader can see the man before him. His muscles called for work, his stupidity would have none of it. He was a great idle force. He was an assassin through coolness. He was thought to be a Creole. He had probably somewhat to do with Marshal Brune, having been a porter at Avignon in 1815. After this stage he had turned ruffian. The diaphaneity of Babet contrasted with the grossness of Gueulemer. Babet was thin and learned. He was transparent but impenetrable. Daylight was visible through his bones, but nothing through his eyes. He declared that he was a chemist. He had been a jack of all trades. He had played in vaudeville at Saint-Mihiel. He was a man of purpose, a fine talker, who underlined his smiles and accentuated his gestures. His occupation consisted in selling, in the open air, plaster busts and portraits of the head of the state. In addition to this, he extracted teeth. He had exhibited phenomena at fairs, and he had owned a booth with a trumpet and this poster: Babet, dental artist, member of the academies, makes physical experiments on metals and metalloids, extracts teeth, undertakes stumps abandoned by his brother practitioners. Price, 1 tooth, 1 franc 50 centimes, 2 teeth, 2 francs, 3 teeth, 2 francs 50. Take advantage of this opportunity. This take advantage of this opportunity meant have as many teeth extracted as possible. He had been married and had had children. He did not know what had become of his wife and children. He had lost them, as one loses his handkerchief. Babet read the papers, a striking exception in the world to which he belonged. One day, at the period when he had his family with him in his booth on wheels, he had read in the Messager that a woman had just given birth to a child who was doing well, and had a calf's muzzle, and he exclaimed, "There's a fortune! My wife has not the wit to present me with a child like that." Later on, he had abandoned everything in order to undertake Paris. This was his expression. Who was Claquesous? He was night. He waited until the sky was daubed with black before he showed himself. At nightfall, he emerged from the hole whither he returned before daylight. Where was this hole? No one knew. He only addressed his accomplices in the most absolute darkness, and with his back turned to them. Was his name Claquesous? Certainly not. If a candle was brought, he put on a mask. He was a ventriloquist. Babet said, "Claquesous is a nocturne for 2 voices." Claquesous was vague, terrible, and a roamer. No one was sure whether he had a name, Claquesous being a sobriquet. None was sure that he had a voice, as his stomach spoke more frequently than his voice. No one was sure that he had a face, as he was never seen without his mask. He disappeared as though he had vanished into thin air. When he appeared, it was as though he sprang from the earth. A lugubrious being was Montparnasse. Montparnasse was a child, less than 20 years of age, with a handsome face, lips like cherries, charming black hair, the brilliant light of springtime in his eyes. He had all vices and aspired to all crimes. The digestion of evil aroused in him an appetite for worse. It was the street boy turned pickpocket, and a pickpocket turned garrotter. He was genteel, effeminate, graceful, robust, sluggish, ferocious. The rim of his hat was curled up on the left side, in order to make room for a tuft of hair after the style of 1829. He lived by robbery with violence. His coat was of the best cut, but threadbare. Montparnasse was a fashion plate in misery, and given to the commission of murders. The cause of all this youth's crimes was the desire to be well dressed. The first grisette who had said to him, "You are handsome," had cast the stain of darkness into his heart, and had made a Cain of this Abel. Finding that he was handsome, he desired to be elegant. Now, the height of elegance is idleness. Idleness in a poor man means crime. Few prowlers were so dreaded as Montparnasse. At 18 he had already numerous corpses in his past. More than one passer-by lay with outstretched arms in the presence of this wretch, with his face in a pool of blood. Curled, pomaded, with laced waist, the hips of a woman, the bust of a Prussian officer, the murmur of admiration from the boulevard wenches surrounding him, his cravat knowingly tied, a bludgeon in his pocket, a flower in his buttonhole. Such was this dandy of the sepulchre. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4. Composition of the Troupe. These 4 ruffians formed a sort of Proteus, winding like a serpent among the police and striving to escape Vidocq's indiscreet glances under divers forms, tree, flame, fountain, lending each other their names and their traps, hiding in their own shadows, boxes with secret compartments and refuges for each other. Stripping off their personalities as one removes his false nose at a masked ball, sometimes simplifying matters to the point of consisting of but one individual, sometimes multiplying themselves to such a point that Coco Latour himself took them for a whole throng. These 4 men were not 4 men. They were a sort of mysterious robber with 4 heads, operating on a grand scale on Paris. They were that monstrous polyp of evil which inhabits the crypt of society. Thanks to their ramifications and to the network underlying their relations, Babet, Gueulemer, Claquesous, and Montparnasse were charged with the general enterprise of the ambushes of the Department of the Seine. The inventors of ideas of that nature, men with nocturnal imaginations, applied to them to have their ideas executed. They furnished the canvas to the 4 rascals, and the latter undertook the preparation of the scenery. They laboured at the stage setting. They were always in a condition to lend a force proportioned and suitable to all crimes which demanded a lift of the shoulder, and which were sufficiently lucrative. When a crime was in quest of alms, they underlet their accomplices. They kept a troupe of actors of the shadows at the disposition of all underground tragedies. They were in the habit of assembling at nightfall, the hour when they woke up, on the plains which adjoin the Salpêtrière. There they held their conferences. They had 12 black hours before them. They regulated their employment accordingly. Patron Minette, such was the name which was bestowed in the subterranean circulation on the association of these 4 men. In the fantastic ancient popular parlance, which is vanishing day by day, Patron Minette signifies the morning, the same as entre chien et loup, between dog and wolf, signifies the evening. This appellation, Patron Minette, was probably derived from the hour at which their work ended, the dawn being the vanishing moment for phantoms and for the separation of ruffians. These 4 men were known under this title. When the Président of the Assizes visited Lacenaire in his prison and questioned him concerning a misdeed which Lacenaire denied, "Who did it?" demanded the Président. Lacenaire made this response, enigmatical so far as the magistrate was concerned, but clear to the police. Perhaps it was Patron Minette. A piece can sometimes be divined on the enunciation of the personages. In the same manner, a band can almost be judged from the list of ruffians composing it. Here are the appellations to which the principal members of Patron Minette answered, for the names have survived in special memoirs. Panchaud, alias Printanier, alias Bigrenaille. Brujon. There was a Brujon dynasty. We cannot refrain from interpolating this word. Boulatruelle, the road mender already introduced. La Veuve, Finistère. Omer Augu, a Negro. Mardi soir, Tuesday evening. Dépêche, make haste. Fauntleroy, alias Bouquetière, the flower girl. Glorieux, a discharged convict. Bar à carrosse, stop carriage, called Monsieur Dupont. L'Esplanade du Sud. Pousse à Grive. Carmagnolet. Cruydenier, called Bizarro. Mange dentelle, lace eater. Les pieds en l'air, feet in the air. Demi-liard, called 2 milliards, etc., etc. We pass over some, and not the worst of them. These names have faces attached. They do not express merely beings, but species. Each one of these names corresponds to a variety of those misshapen fungi from the underside of civilization. Those beings who were not very lavish with their countenances were not among the men whom one sees passing along the streets. Fatigued by the wild nights which they passed, they went off by day to sleep, sometimes in the lime kilns, sometimes in the abandoned quarries of Montmartre or Montrouge, sometimes in the sewers. They ran to earth. What became of these men? They still exist. They have always existed. Horace speaks of them. Ambubayarum collegia, pharmacopolae, mendici, mimae. And so long as society remains what it is, they will remain what they are. Beneath the obscure roof of their cavern, they are continually born again from the social ooze. They return spectres, but always identical. Only they no longer bear the same names, and they are no longer in the same skins. The individuals extirpated, the tribe subsists. They always have the same faculties. From the vagrant to the tramp, the race is maintained in its purity. They divine purses in pockets. They scent out watches in fobs. Gold and silver possess an odour for them. There exist ingenuous bourgeois of whom it might be said that they have a stealable air. These men patiently pursue these bourgeois. They experience the quivers of a spider at the passage of a stranger or of a man from the country. These men are terrible when one encounters them or catches a glimpse of them towards midnight on a deserted boulevard. They do not seem to be men, but forms composed of living mists. One would say that they habitually constitute one mass with the shadows, that they are in no wise distinct from them, that they possess no other soul than the darkness, and that it is only momentarily and for the purpose of living for a few minutes a monstrous life that they have separated from the night. What is necessary to cause these spectres to vanish? Light. Light in floods. Not a single bat can resist the dawn. Light up society from below. End of chapter 4.